The church doors burst open at dawn, and the scream that followed would haunt the Miller ranch for decades. Clara Miller, the beautiful coveted bride promised to unite two empires, had vanished into the night with a drifter's son. In her place stood Lydia, the sister no one remembered existed, trembling before 300 witnesses. Within the hour, her father would auction her off like damaged livestock to save his reputation. Within 2 hours, she would become the wife of a man who'd never looked at her twice. And within 3 months, she would either destroy him or save them both. This is where their story begins. If you want to see how this impossible marriage survives betrayal, wealth, and a father's wrath, stay until the end. And drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The morning of June 14th, 1887, began with the kind of silence that precedes disaster. Lydia Miller had been awake since 4, her hands raw from scrubbing the church steps that her sister's feet would grace in exactly 5 hours. The granite was already spotless, but Lydia scrubbed anyway, her thick fingers working the brush in methodical circles while the Wyoming sunrise bled crimson across the mountains. She'd learned long ago that keeping busy kept the thoughts away. Thoughts about how Clara's wedding dress had required 3 seamstresses while Lydia's Sunday clothes came from the charity bin. Thoughts about how their father spoke of Clara like a prized mare, and Lydia like an unfortunate obligation. "You missed a spot!" Lydia's head snapped up. Her mother stood in the church doorway, corseted so tightly her face had gone pale, her eyes scanning Lydia with the clinical disappointment of a woman inspecting bruised fruit. "Where?" Lydia asked quietly. "Everywhere." Margaret Miller descended the steps, her silk skirts whispering against the stone. "Your sister's wedding will be perfect, Lydia. It has to be. Do you understand what's at stake today?" Lydia understood perfectly. Clara's marriage to Caleb Ryder would merge the Miller cattle empire with the Ryder land holdings, creating the largest ranch operation in 3 territories. Politicians were coming, railroad investors, men who could make or break a family's fortune with a signature. And Lydia, the fat daughter no one wanted to claim, would stand in the back and try not to be noticed. "Yes, Mama." "Then fix your hair. You look like a field hand." Margaret turned back toward the church, then paused. "And Lydia? Stay in the kitchen during the reception. People are coming to celebrate beauty today, not—" She gestured vaguely at Lydia's rounded figure. "Not whatever you are." The words landed like stones. Lydia nodded, her throat tight, and returned to scrubbing steps that didn't need scrubbing. By 8 o'clock, the town of Redemption Bend had transformed into chaos. Wagons clogged Main Street, their beds loaded with families in their finest clothes. The hotel was full, the saloon was serving breakfast whiskey, and the general store had sold out of ribbon and rice. Everyone wanted to witness the wedding of the decade, the union that would reshape the entire territory's power structure. Inside the Miller house, 3 miles from town, Clara Miller sat before her vanity mirror and smiled at her reflection like a woman who'd never doubted her own perfection. "Tighter," she commanded, and her maid pulled the corset laces until Clara's waist measured an impossible 18 inches. The wedding dress, imported from Paris, constructed of silk and Belgian lace, hung on the door like a ghost made of money. Clara's dark hair had been curled into glossy ringlets, her lips rouged, her neck adorned with pearls that had belonged to her grandmother. She looked like a painting. She looked like everything Lydia would never be. "Miss Clara," the maid whispered nervously, "your father says the carriages are ready. It's time." Clara's smile widened. "Tell him I need 5 more minutes. A bride should never be early to her own wedding." But Clara Miller wasn't planning to be late either. She was planning not to arrive at all. At 8:47 a.m., while her father paced the foyer and her mother fretted over flower arrangements, Clara slipped out the back door in her riding boots and a split skirt hidden under her dressing gown. At the edge of the property, where the cottonwood trees grew thick enough to hide secrets, a man waited with 2 horses. His name was James Thornton, and he was everything Clara's future husband wasn't: dangerous, unpredictable, and thrilling in the way that only forbidden things can be. The son of a traveling gambler, he had no land, no prospects, and no future. He also had the kind of smile that made Clara forget about empires and alliances and the comfortable prison of wealth. "You came," James breathed, pulling her into his arms. "Did you doubt me?" Clara kissed him hard, tasting whiskey and freedom. I told you, I'm not marrying some rancher who smells like cattle and thinks conversation means discussing rainfall. Your father will hunt us. Let him try. Clara swung onto the horse with practiced ease. By the time they realize I'm gone, we'll be across the territorial line. I have money, enough to get us to California. She'd stolen it from her father's safe 2 weeks ago, $3,000 in railroad bonds that he wouldn't miss until the quarterly audit. By then, Clara Miller would be someone else entirely, living under a new name in a city where no one cared about cattle empires or frontier marriages. James grinned, wild and reckless. Then let's give them a wedding to remember. They rode hard toward the border, leaving nothing behind but hoofprints and the kind of scandal that destroys families. At 9:15 a.m., Margaret Miller opened Clara's bedroom door to find it empty. The scream that followed carried through the house like a bullet, sharp and devastating. Within seconds, Thomas Miller, a man whose word could move mountains and whose temper could flatten anyone fool enough to cross him, was tearing through his daughter's room, yanking open drawers and throwing open wardrobes. The Paris dress still hung on the door. The pearls lay on the vanity. But Clara was gone, and so was the bay mare from the stable, and so was any hope of salvaging the day. "Find her!" Thomas roared at his ranch hands. "Search every inch of this property. She can't have gone far." But Clara had gone very far, and she wasn't coming back. At 9:30, Thomas sent a rider to the church with instructions to delay the ceremony. At 9:45, the rider returned with grim news. Over 300 guests had already arrived, including Elias Ryder, Caleb's father, and the most powerful rancher in Wyoming, who was not a man who tolerated being made to wait. At 10 a.m., Thomas Miller made the decision that would change 3 lives forever. "Get Lydia," he told his wife, his voice cold as winter stone. "Get her dressed, now." Margaret's face went white. "Thomas, you can't be serious." "Do I look like I'm joking?" Thomas grabbed his wife's shoulders hard enough to bruise. "We have a church full of politicians, investors, and every important family in 3 territories. The Ryders are expecting a wedding. If we don't deliver a bride, Elias will destroy us. He'll call in every debt, block every business deal, and make sure the Miller name is mud before sunset." "But Lydia isn't, she's not." Margaret couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice what they both knew. Lydia wasn't beautiful, wasn't charming, wasn't anything close to what the Ryders had been promised. "She's a daughter," Thomas said flatly. "She'll have to be enough." They found Lydia in the church kitchen, arranging sandwiches on silver platters for the reception that would never happen. She looked up when her parents entered, and the expression on their faces made her stomach drop. "Lydia," her father said, and his voice held a tone she'd never heard before, something between desperation and disgust. "Your sister is gone." The platter slipped from Lydia's hands, shattering on the floor. "What?" "She ran off with some drifter." Margaret's lips were so tight they'd gone bloodless. "Left us all to deal with the consequences of her selfishness." Lydia's mind spun. Clara was gone. The wedding was off. The alliance was broken. Her father's empire was. "Which is why you're going to fix this," Thomas continued. And that's when Lydia understood. "No." The word came out as barely a whisper. "Papa, no. You can't. I can't." "You can, and you will." Thomas stepped closer, his eyes hard. "There are 300 people in that church. The Ryders, the territorial governor, railroad investors who came all the way from Chicago. If we cancel this wedding, we're finished. Elias Ryder will make sure of it." "But they're expecting Clara," Lydia's voice cracked. "They're expecting someone beautiful and elegant, and—" "They're expecting a Miller daughter," Thomas interrupted. "Contract says a Miller daughter. It doesn't specify which one." The cruelty of it hit Lydia like a physical blow. She wasn't a daughter. She was a loophole. "I won't do it," Lydia said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "I won't marry a stranger to save your business deal." Thomas's hand cracked across her face so fast she didn't see it coming. The force knocked her sideways into the counter, her cheek exploding in pain. "You'll do exactly what I tell you," Thomas said quietly, and the softness of his voice was more terrifying than shouting. "I fed you for 23 years, clothed you, given you a roof over your head despite the fact that you've never been anything but a burden and an embarrassment. You owe me this, Lydia. You owe me everything." Tears burned hot down Lydia's face, but she didn't make a sound. "Now get upstairs," Thomas ordered. "Your mother will get you ready. You have 20 minutes." What followed was the most humiliating 20 minutes of Lydia's life. Clara's wedding dress didn't fit. It wouldn't zip past Lydia's hips, and the bodice gaped where Clara's perfect figure had filled it. Margaret and two seamstresses worked frantically with pins and thread, stabbing Lydia's skin as they tried to make adjustments that would never be enough. "Suck in," Margaret hissed, yanking the fabric. "I am sucking in." "Well, suck in more." They settled on a different dress, Lydia's Sunday best, a plain cream gown that did nothing to disguise her size and everything to emphasize how completely wrong she was for this moment. Her hair was too short to curl like Clara's, so they pinned it back severely. She had no pearls, no rouge, no anything that might transform her into something acceptable. When Margaret stepped back to assess the damage, her expression said everything Lydia needed to know. "It'll have to do," Margaret said finally, and it sounded like a eulogy. At 10:42 a.m., Lydia Miller walked down the aisle of Redemption Bend Church. The sanctuary had been decorated for Clara. White roses and silk ribbons, candles in crystal holders, everything beautiful and expensive and perfect. 300 faces turned toward the doors as Lydia entered, and the collective gasp that followed felt like being stripped naked in front of the entire world. She heard the whispers immediately. "That's not Clara. Is that the fat sister? What's happening? Where's the real bride?" Lydia kept her eyes down, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the simple bouquet someone had shoved at her. Each step down the aisle felt like walking to her execution. She could feel their stares, their judgment, their confusion turning to cruel amusement. At the altar stood Caleb Ryder. Lydia had seen him before. Everyone in Redemption Bend knew the Ryder family, but they'd never spoken. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from years of hard ranch work. At 28, he was considered the territory's most eligible bachelor, and he'd been promised the most beautiful bride in Wyoming. Instead, he was getting Lydia. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second, and what Lydia saw there made her want to disappear into the floorboards. Confusion, then recognition, then something that looked dangerously close to pity. But before Caleb could speak, Thomas Miller stepped forward to address the congregation, his voice booming with false confidence. "Friends, family, distinguished guests," Thomas began, and Lydia watched her father transform into a performer, his face arranged in an expression of calm authority despite the chaos burning beneath. "I know you're confused. I know this isn't what you expected, but I want to assure you that today's wedding will proceed exactly as planned." The murmuring grew louder. Someone in the back laughed, sharp and cruel. "My daughter Clara," Thomas continued, each word carefully chosen, "has chosen a different path. She left this morning to pursue her own future. It was unexpected, but we respect her decision." That was a lie. The biggest lie Lydia had ever heard. "However," Thomas raised his voice over the rising chatter, "a contract is a contract. The Miller and Ryder families agreed to unite through marriage, and that agreement will be honored. I present to you my daughter Lydia." "The fat one?" someone shouted from the crowd, and laughter rippled through the church like poison. Lydia's face burned. She wanted to run, to disappear, to die right there on the altar, rather than endure another second of this nightmare. "Who will marry Caleb Ryder today?" Thomas finished, his voice hard as iron, "thus fulfilling the terms of our agreement." The sanctuary erupted. People were standing, arguing, laughing. Someone called it a farce. Someone else called it an insult. A woman near the front fanned herself dramatically and declared she'd never seen such a scandal. And then Elias Ryder stood up. The room fell silent instantly. Elias Ryder commanded attention the way mountains commanded the landscape, immovable, ancient, and absolutely dominant. At 62, he was still powerful enough to break a man's jaw and wealthy enough to buy his silence afterward. He'd built his empire from nothing, crushed his competitors without mercy, and raised his son to inherit everything. He looked at Lydia the way someone might look at a diseased animal. "This," Elias said slowly, his voice carrying to every corner of the church, "is an insult." Thomas's face went rigid. "Elias, the contract was for Clara Miller. Elias interrupted. A woman of quality, a woman worthy of the Rider name, not, he gestured dismissively at Lydia, not this. The cruelty was casual, devastating. Lydia felt something inside her crack and crumble. Your daughter humiliated my family, Elias continued, addressing Thomas, but speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. She made fools of us all, and now you expect me to accept your leftover daughter as compensation? Leftover. The word hung in the air like a sentence. Caleb, Elias turned to his son, we're leaving. This wedding is canceled. For a long moment, nothing happened. 300 people held their breath, waiting to see if the most powerful rancher in Wyoming would walk out of the church and end the Miller Empire with a single exit. But then Caleb Ryder did something no one, least of all his father, expected. He took one step toward Lydia and spoke directly to her for the first time. What's your full name? His voice was quiet, meant only for her, but in the shocked silence of the church it carried. Lydia's throat was so tight she could barely breathe. Lydia Ann Miller. How old are you? 23. Can you read? The question surprised her. Yes. Can you manage household accounts? Yes, I've been managing my father's ranch books for 5 years. Something shifted in Caleb's expression. Not attraction, not affection, but something else. Calculation, maybe. Or recognition. Then I'll marry you, Caleb said. The church erupted again, but this time the chaos had a different quality. Shock instead of mockery. Disbelief instead of amusement. Caleb, no! Elias's voice cracked like a whip. I forbid it! Caleb turned to his father, and for the first time in his life, his voice held steel. You don't own me. I own everything you have, Elias roared. The ranch, the cattle, the land. It's all mine until I say otherwise. If you marry this woman, I'll strip you of everything. Then strip me. Caleb's jaw was set, his eyes hard. I'd rather have nothing than spend one more day being your puppet. The words landed like a declaration of war. Elias's face went purple with rage. You ungrateful... I'm grateful for nothing, Caleb interrupted. You raised me to take orders, to follow your plans, to marry whoever you chose because it served your empire. Well, I'm done. If you want to disown me, do it. But I'm marrying Lydia Miller today, and there's nothing you can do to stop me. The silence that followed was absolute. Lydia stared at Caleb, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break her ribs. This man, this stranger, was sacrificing everything for her. But not for her, she realized. For himself. For his freedom. She was just the weapon he'd chosen to finally fight back against his father. It should have hurt. It should have felt like another humiliation. Instead, it felt like the only honest thing that had happened all day. Reverend, Caleb said, never breaking eye contact with his father. Begin the ceremony. The Reverend, a nervous man in his 50s who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else, cleared his throat. Well, if both parties consent, we consent, Caleb said firmly. Then he looked at Lydia. Don't we? It wasn't a question, it was a lifeline. Lydia thought about her father, who'd slapped her and called her a burden. She thought about her mother, who'd spent 23 years being ashamed of her. She thought about Clara, who'd abandoned her without a second thought. She thought about every person in this church who'd laughed at her, pitied her, or looked through her like she didn't exist. And then she thought about what would happen if she said no. She'd go back to the Miller Ranch as the daughter who'd ruined everything. She'd spend the rest of her life paying for Clara's choice, blamed for a scandal she didn't create, treated like garbage by a family that had never wanted her. Or she could say yes. She could marry a stranger who was using her as rebellion. She could walk out of this church as someone's wife, even if that someone was only marrying her out of spite. At least spite was honest. We consent, Lydia whispered. The ceremony that followed was brutal in its efficiency. The Reverend raced through the vows like a man trying to finish before someone stopped him. Caleb repeated his lines in a flat, emotionless voice. Lydia could barely hear herself speak over the pounding of her pulse. No one objected because no one could quite believe what they were witnessing. Elias Ryder stood frozen in the aisle, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. But he didn't leave. Leaving would mean admitting defeat, and men like Elias Ryder didn't admit defeat. Do you, Caleb Nathaniel Ryder, take this woman? I do. And do you, Lydia Ann Miller? I do. Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, I now pronounce you husband and wife. The Reverend didn't say you may kiss the bride. He didn't have to. Everyone knew this wasn't that kind of wedding. Caleb took Lydia's hand, his palm rough with calluses, his grip firm but impersonal, and turned toward the congregation. 300 faces stared back, some shocked, some amused, some disgusted. "It's done," Caleb announced to the room. Then he looked directly at his father. "We're married, legal and binding. You can't change it." Elias's voice came out strangled, barely human. "You just destroyed your life for a woman you don't even know." "No," Caleb replied quietly. "I just saved it." He led Lydia down the aisle, past rows of whispering guests, past her parents who wouldn't meet her eyes, past Elias Ryder, who looked like he wanted to commit murder. The church doors opened and June sunlight poured in, blinding and merciless. A wagon waited outside, Caleb's wagon, meant to carry him and his beautiful bride to the reception. Instead, it would carry him and Lydia to his ranch, to a life neither of them had chosen, to a marriage that had started as a weapon and would either become something real or destroy them both. Caleb helped Lydia into the wagon with mechanical politeness, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. "Wait!" Thomas Miller burst through the church doors, his face desperate. "Lydia, your things. You'll need your clothes, your belongings. Send them," Caleb said coldly, and snapped the reins. The wagon lurched forward, and Lydia looked back once, just once, at the church, the crowd, the life she was leaving behind. No one waved goodbye. As they drove through Redemption Bend, people stopped to stare. Word had already spread. The fastest gossip in territorial history. The bride who vanished, the sister who took her place, the son who defied his father. By nightfall, the story would be legend. By next week, it would be twisted into a dozen different versions, each more scandalous than the last. But right now, in this wagon, there was only silence. Caleb drove with his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the road. Lydia sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her cream dress already dusty from the road. Neither spoke. What was there to say? The Ryder Ranch lay 15 miles north of town, through open prairie and rolling hills. Beautiful country, harsh country. The kind of land that rewarded strength and punished weakness. Lydia had never been this far from Redemption Bend. She'd spent her entire life within a 5-mile radius of her father's ranch, managing books and kitchens and all the invisible work that kept an empire running while Clara attended parties and charmed investors. After an hour of silence, Caleb finally spoke. "You can manage ranch accounts?" Lydia nodded. "Yes." "Good. Mine are a mess." That was it. That was all he said. Not, "Welcome to your new home," or "I'm sorry this happened," or "We'll figure this out together." Just a practical statement about the work she'd be doing. Fine, Lydia thought. If this was a business arrangement, she could handle that. Business was clearer than emotion. Numbers didn't lie or humiliate or abandon you. "What else do you need me to do?" she asked quietly. Caleb glanced at her, surprise flickering across his face. "You're asking what I expect from you? We're married now. You must have expectations. I expect you to live in my house and not cause trouble. Beyond that," he shrugged. "I don't know. I didn't plan this. Neither did I." The honesty hung between them, sharp and strange. "Do you regret it?" Caleb asked after a moment. Lydia considered the question carefully. Did she regret marrying a stranger? Did she regret leaving her family? Did she regret becoming a wife instead of a leftover daughter? "No," she said finally. "Do you?" Caleb was quiet for a long time. When he answered, his voice was low and hard. "Ask me in a year." The Ryder Ranch appeared on the horizon just as the sun began its descent. It was bigger than Lydia expected. The main house was a sprawling 2-story structure built from local timber and stone, surrounded by corrals, barns, and bunkhouses. Cattle dotted the hillsides in every direction. This was a working ranch, she realized, a serious operation, and now it was supposed to be her home. Caleb stopped the wagon in front of the house and climbed down. He didn't help Lydia, not out of cruelty, she thought, but out of distraction. His mind was clearly elsewhere, already moving through whatever consequences would come from his choice. "I'll get your things once your father sends them," Caleb said, walking toward the house. "For now, I'll show you where you'll sleep." Lydia followed him inside, her heart sinking with each step. The house was beautiful, but neglected. Dust covered the furniture. Dishes were piled in the kitchen. Papers and ledgers were scattered across the dining table. This was a house that hadn't had a woman's touch in years, or maybe ever. Caleb led her upstairs to a bedroom that had clearly been prepared for Clara. White lace curtains, fresh flowers in a crystal vase, a beautiful quilt on the bed. Someone, probably the housekeeper, had tried to make it perfect for a beautiful bride. It felt like a museum display for a life Lydia would never have. "This is your room," Caleb said flatly. "Mine is across the hall. If you need anything—" He stopped, seeming to realize he didn't know what she might need. "Just figure it out." Then he left. Lydia stood alone in the beautiful bedroom, in her dusty cream dress, in a house she didn't know, married to a man who'd chosen her as an act of rebellion, not desire. And for the first time since her father had slapped her that morning, Lydia allowed herself to cry. She cried for the humiliation of the church. She cried for her sister's betrayal. She cried for the mother who'd called her an embarrassment and the father who'd called her a burden. She cried for the future she'd imagined, small and quiet, maybe, but at least familiar, that was now completely gone. But underneath the grief, something else stirred. Anger. Raw, clean, clarifying anger. Her family had treated her like garbage for 23 years. They'd used her labor, dismissed her value, and then sold her off to save their reputation. Clara had run away without a thought for what it would cost Lydia. Her mother had dressed her like a consolation prize. Her father had slapped her and called her a burden. Well, Lydia thought, wiping her tears with sharp, angry swipes, if they wanted her to be a burden, she'd show them exactly how much weight she could carry. She'd make this marriage work. Not for Caleb, who'd married her out of spite. Not for her parents, who didn't deserve her success. But for herself. She'd prove that the unwanted daughter could build something worth having. Lydia stood up, smoothed her dress, and walked back downstairs. She found Caleb in his office, staring at a pile of papers with the kind of exhausted frustration that comes from avoiding a problem too long. "Where are the ranch ledgers?" Lydia asked from the doorway. Caleb looked up, startled. "What?" "The ledgers. You said your accounts are a mess. I'm going to fix them." "Right now?" "Why not? It's not like I have anything else to do." Caleb studied her for a long moment, and Lydia forced herself not to flinch under his gaze. She was done being ashamed of who she was. Finally, Caleb pulled open a drawer and extracted 3 leather-bound ledgers, handing them to her. "Good luck. I haven't balanced them in 8 months." Lydia took the books and settled at the dining table. When she opened the first ledger, her accountant's heart sank. The entries were incomplete, inconsistent, and often illegible. Numbers didn't add up. Expenses weren't categorized. It was financial chaos. It would take her weeks to sort out. Perfect. She pulled out a pen, a fresh sheet of paper, and began to work. Hours passed. The sun set. The house grew dark except for the single lamp Lydia had lit. Caleb came through once, stopped when he saw her bent over the ledgers, opened his mouth as if to say something, then thought better of it and left. Lydia worked until her eyes burned and her hand cramped. She worked until she'd cataloged every error, every missing entry, every discrepancy. She worked until she understood exactly how much trouble this ranch was in. And it was in trouble. Serious trouble. Debts were mounting. Feed costs were outpacing revenue. Several major accounts were months overdue. Without intervention, the Ryder Ranch would be bankrupt within 2 years. No wonder Elias had been so desperate for this marriage alliance. He needed the Miller capital to keep his empire afloat. Lydia sat back, her mind racing. She could fix this. She knew exactly how to fix this. But did she want to? Did she want to save the ranch of a man who'd married her as a weapon against his father? Did she want to prove her value to a husband who saw her as convenient rather than wanted? Yes, she realized. Not for him. For herself. Because when Caleb finally looked at her, really looked at her, she wanted him to see someone worth choosing, not out of rebellion or spite or convenience, worth choosing because she'd earned it. Lydia picked up her pen and kept working. Outside, the Wyoming night settled over the ranch like a blanket. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes howled, cattle shifted in their sleep, and in a house that had never been a home, two strangers began the long, painful process of becoming something more. Neither of them knew it yet. But this was how their story truly began. Not in a church full of witnesses, but in silence and work, and the stubborn refusal to let humiliation be the final word. The unwanted bride was about to show them all what she was worth. The first full day of Lydia's marriage began at dawn with the sound of boots on hardwood and the slam of a door that rattled the windows in their frames. She'd barely slept. The beautiful bedroom felt like a cage decorated with someone else's dreams, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw 300 faces laughing at her in that church. So she'd lain awake most of the night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch, cattle lowing in the distance, wind scraping across the roof, the creak of settling timber. When Caleb's boots thundered down the stairs before sunrise, Lydia rose and dressed quickly in the same cream gown from yesterday, now wrinkled and stained. Her trunks from home hadn't arrived yet. She suspected they never would. The kitchen was cold and empty. No coffee brewing, no breakfast prepared, no sign that anyone lived here beyond the dirty dishes piled in the basin and the stale bread on the counter. Lydia stood in the doorway for a moment, taking it all in with the practiced eye of someone who'd been managing households since she was 15. This wasn't just neglect. This was a man who'd never learned to take care of himself because someone had always done it for him. She found wood by the stove and got a fire going. The coffee was old but serviceable. While it brewed, she investigated the pantry and found it better stocked than she'd expected. Flour, cornmeal, dried beans, salt pork. Someone had laid in supplies, though from the dust on the shelves, nobody had cooked a proper meal in months. Lydia was elbow-deep in bacon grease and scrambled eggs when Caleb came back inside, his face already lined with the kind of weariness that comes from carrying too much alone. He stopped when he saw her at the stove. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his voice rough. "You need to eat," Lydia replied without turning around. "So do I. Seems practical." Caleb moved to the table but didn't sit. He stood there awkwardly, like a guest in his own house, watching her work. The silence stretched thin and uncomfortable between them. "I don't expect you to cook," he said finally, "or clean, or any of that. I can hire someone from town." "With what money?" Lydia cracked another egg into the pan. "Your accounts show you're $600 behind on feed costs alone. The bunkhouse roof needs replacing. You owe the bank $1,700 by September, and your cattle sales won't cover half of it." The silence that followed had a different quality now, shock instead of discomfort. "You went through my ledgers." "You told me to." Lydia plated the eggs and bacon with efficient movements, then turned to face him. "You said your accounts were a mess. They're worse than a mess. They're a disaster. If you don't make changes in the next 3 months, you'll lose this ranch." Caleb's jaw tightened. "My father said—" "Your father's been lying to you." Lydia set the plates on the table with more force than necessary. "The numbers don't lie. This ranch is failing, and it's been failing for at least 2 years. That's why he needed the Miller Alliance. That's why he was desperate enough to arrange your marriage to Clara. He needs capital, and he needs it now." She watched the realization move across Caleb's face like a storm cloud. His hands clenched into fists, then slowly relaxed. When he spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that if you died tomorrow, your father would inherit a bankrupt estate." Lydia sat down and started eating, her appetite returning for the first time since the wedding. "But not so bad that it can't be fixed, if you're willing to work." Caleb sat down slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. "You can fix it?" "I can try." Lydia met his gaze steadily. "I managed my father's books for 5 years. His ranch turned a 40% profit last year. I know what I'm doing." "Then why didn't he—" Caleb stopped himself, but Lydia knew the question he wasn't asking. "Why didn't your father value you? Why did he treat you like garbage if you were that good?" "Because I'm fat and plain and not useful for making alliances," Lydia said flatly, saving him the trouble. "Numbers don't matter if you're not pretty enough to hang on a man's arm at parties." Caleb flinched. "That's not— It's exactly what you thought when you saw me in that church." Lydia cut into her eggs with sharp, precise movements. Don't pretend otherwise. I saw your face. Everyone did. The truth hung between them like broken glass, sharp and impossible to ignore. You're right, Caleb said quietly, and the admission surprised her. I was expecting Clara. I was expecting someone. He trailed off, searching for words that wouldn't wound. Beautiful, Lydia finished for him. Charming, elegant, everything I'm not. I was going to say someone I'd met before. Caleb pushed his eggs around his plate. Clara and I were introduced 6 months ago at a territorial governor's dinner. We talked for maybe 15 minutes. She seemed pleasant enough, but I barely remembered her face. The marriage was my father's idea, not mine. But you agreed to it. I agreed to stop him from choosing someone worse. Caleb's voice was bitter. My father's been parading eligible women in front of me since I turned 25. Every dinner party, every social event, every trip to town, there was always some rancher's daughter or banker's niece he wanted me to court. I got tired of fighting him. When he suggested Clara Miller, I said yes just to end the conversation. Lydia absorbed this information slowly. So you didn't want to marry her either. I didn't want to marry anyone. Caleb finally looked up and his eyes held something raw and honest. But if I had to get married to satisfy my father's obsession with alliances, I figured Clara was as good a choice as any. At least she came with enough land to make the misery worthwhile. And then you got me instead. And then I got you instead. Caleb didn't look away. No land, no alliance, just a woman I'd never met and a father who wants to destroy me for choosing her. The words should have hurt. They were designed to hurt. But Lydia had grown a thick skin over 23 years of casual cruelty, and underneath the bluntness, she heard something else. Not quite respect, but acknowledgement. He was being honest with her, and honesty was more than anyone else had ever offered. Then I suppose we're both stuck with something we didn't choose, Lydia said. The question is what we do about it. Caleb studied her for a long moment, and Lydia forced herself not to fidget under his scrutiny. Let him look. Let him see exactly what he'd bargained for. A plain woman with numbers in her head and no patience for pretense. Fix my accounts, Caleb said finally. If you can turn this ranch around, I'll... He paused, then continued with careful deliberation. I'll make sure my father doesn't come after you, or your family. Whatever else happens between us, I won't let him destroy you for my choices. It wasn't a declaration of partnership. It wasn't even kindness. But it was a deal, and Lydia understood deals. Agreed, she said. But I'll need access to everything. All the ledgers, all the contracts, all the land records. And I'll need you to follow my recommendations, even if they're not what you want to hear. Such as? Such as you're overgrazing the north pasture and it's destroying the land. You're paying twice what you should for feed because you're buying from your father's supplier instead of shopping around. And you've got at least 3 ranch hands on the payroll who don't do a full day's work. Caleb's face darkened. You got all that from one night of reading ledgers? I got that from cross-referencing your expenses with your cattle counts and noticing that the numbers don't match what they should. Lydia stood and began clearing the plates. You're hemorrhaging money in a dozen small ways because nobody's been paying attention to the details. That stops now. She expected him to argue, to defend his management, to pull rank as the man of the house. Instead, Caleb pushed back from the table and stood. The ledgers are yours, he said quietly. Do whatever you need to do. Then he walked out, leaving Lydia alone in the kitchen with dirty dishes and the strange, unfamiliar sensation of being trusted with something that mattered. The weeks that followed fell into a pattern as rigid and impersonal as a military drill. Caleb rose before dawn and worked the ranch until dark, riding fence lines, moving cattle, supervising the hands, doing the endless physical labor that kept a ranch operation running. Lydia took over the house and the accounts with the same methodical efficiency she'd brought to her father's ranch. She woke early, cooked breakfast, spent her mornings cleaning years of neglect from corners and cupboards, and spent her afternoons buried in ledgers and correspondence. They rarely spoke beyond the practical necessities of shared space. More coffee? Did the supply order arrive? I'll be late tonight. Their conversations were transactions, nothing more. Lydia's trunks arrived from Redemption Bend 3 days after the wedding, delivered by a ranch hand, not her father, with no note or explanation. She unpacked her plain dresses and simple belongings into the beautiful bedroom that still felt like a museum, then returned to work. She wrote letters to suppliers, negotiating better rates and payment terms. She cataloged every asset on the ranch, from cattle to equipment to buildings, assessing value and condition. She created a budget that would dig them out of debt within 18 months if Caleb followed it. And slowly, grudgingly, the ranch began to respond. The kitchen became a place that smelled like fresh bread and coffee instead of stale neglect. The accounts balanced for the first time in years. The supply costs dropped by 30% when Lydia found a new feed distributor out of Cheyenne who was hungry for business and willing to deal. Caleb noticed. He didn't say much, but Lydia caught him watching her sometimes with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between surprise and reassessment, as if he was seeing her for the first time and didn't quite know what to make of what he found. 3 weeks into the marriage, he came home to find a hot meal on the table and sat down without comment. After eating in silence for several minutes, he spoke. "The north pasture," he said. "You said I'm overgrazing it." "You are. The grass is already showing wear patterns. Another year like this and it'll be dust." "So what do I do?" Lydia set down her fork. "Rotate the herd. Move half the cattle to the eastern section for 6 months. Let the north recover. It'll cut your immediate grazing space, but in the long term, you'll have healthier land and healthier cattle." "My father always said—" "Your father's methods are killing this ranch," Lydia interrupted, her voice sharper than she intended. "You can keep following his advice and lose everything, or you can try something different." Caleb's jaw worked for a moment, and Lydia braced herself for anger. Instead, he nodded slowly. "I'll move them tomorrow." It was the first time he'd taken her advice without argument, and something small and cautious unfurled in Lydia's chest. Not affection. She wasn't foolish enough to mistake business cooperation for warmth, but recognition. He was starting to see her as competent, useful. It was more than her own family had ever given her. That night, Lydia worked late on a proposal to the Territorial Bank for better loan terms. The current interest rate was predatory, designed to keep borrowers trapped in permanent debt. But she'd found language in the contract that allowed for renegotiation if certain conditions were met, and she was drafting an argument that the bank would find hard to refuse. She was so absorbed in the work that she didn't hear Caleb come into the dining room until he spoke. "You're still awake." Lydia looked up, startled. Caleb stood in the doorway in his work clothes, his face lined with exhaustion. It was past midnight. "So are you," she said. "Calf got stuck in a ravine. Took 3 of us 2 hours to get her out." He moved closer, looking at the papers spread across the table. "What's all this?" "A proposal to renegotiate your bank loan." Lydia turned the document so he could see. "If we can get the interest rate down from 12% to 8%, we'll save almost $400 over the term. That's $400 we can put toward actual improvements instead of lining the banker's pockets." Caleb picked up the proposal and read it slowly, his lips moving slightly as he worked through the legal language. When he finished, he set it down carefully. "This is good?" he said quietly. "Really good." "How did you—" "I read," Lydia said simply. "A lot. When everyone else was at parties and socials, I was in my father's library learning contract law and agricultural economics. It's amazing what you can pick up when nobody expects you to be decorative." The bitterness in her voice was impossible to miss. Caleb sat down across from her, his movements slow and deliberate. "Your family really was terrible to you, weren't they?" The question was gentle, but it hit like a fist. Lydia's hand stilled on the papers. "It doesn't matter anymore," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "I'm here now. They're there. What they think of me isn't relevant. It matters if it still hurts." Lydia looked up sharply, searching Caleb's face for mockery or pity. She found neither, just exhaustion and something that might have been understanding. "Why do you care?" The question came out harsher than she intended. "This marriage is business, remember? I fix your accounts. You protect me from your father. Feelings aren't part of the deal." "Maybe they should be." Caleb leaned back in his chair, studying her. "We're stuck with each other, Lydia, for better or worse, till death or annulment. Seems like it might be easier if we at least tried to be civil." "We are civil." "We're polite. That's different." He rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture of weariness that made him look younger somehow. I know this isn't what you wanted. I know I'm not what you wanted. But we're both here, and we're both trying to make something work out of a disaster. That has to count for something. Lydia wanted to argue, to maintain the careful distance that kept her safe from more disappointment. But the truth was, she was tired. Tired of being alone even when someone was in the room. Tired of eating meals in silence. Tired of lying awake in a beautiful bedroom and feeling like a ghost haunting someone else's life. "What do you want from me?" she asked quietly. "I don't know," Caleb admitted. "But maybe we could start by being honest with each other. No more pretending this is just business when we're both living in the same house, eating the same meals, working toward the same goals. We don't have to be in love, but we could be—" He searched for the word. "Allies. Real ones. Allies. Not friends, not lovers, but allies." The word felt safer than the others, more achievable. "I can try," Lydia said carefully. "If you can." "Deal." Caleb extended his hand across the table, and after a moment's hesitation, Lydia shook it. His palm was rough with calluses, warm and solid. The handshake lasted a second longer than necessary, and when they pulled apart, something in the air between them felt different. Not romantic, but less hostile. Less lonely. "I should sleep," Caleb said, standing. "You should too. Those ledgers will still be there tomorrow. Just 10 more minutes." "That's what you said an hour ago." He paused at the doorway. "Thank you, Lydia, for the proposal, for the work you're doing, for—" He gestured vaguely. "All of it. I know I haven't said it before, but thank you." He left before she could respond, his boots heavy on the stairs. Lydia sat alone in the lamplight, staring at the bank proposal and feeling something warm and fragile stirring beneath her ribs. It wasn't love. It wasn't even affection, really, but it was the first time in her life that someone had thanked her for being exactly who she was. She worked for another hour before finally climbing the stairs to her museum bedroom, and for the first time since the wedding, she fell asleep without crying. The alliance between them grew slowly, carefully, like a plant pushing through rocky soil. Caleb started asking her opinion on ranch decisions. Lydia started explaining her financial reasoning instead of just issuing directives. They began eating breakfast together regularly, trading information about the day's work over coffee and eggs. The silences between them were still frequent, but they no longer felt hostile. They felt comfortable, the way silence can between two people who don't need constant conversation to feel companionable. One evening, 6 weeks into the marriage, Caleb came home to find Lydia in his office, sorting through a box of old documents she'd discovered in the barn. "What are those?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Water rights contracts from 1879. Lydia held up a yellowed paper. "Did you know you have legal access to the entire Northern Creek system? Your grandfather secured it before the territorial regulations changed. This is worth a fortune if drought hits." Caleb came closer, reading over her shoulder. "My father never mentioned it. Your father probably doesn't know. These were buried under 3 years of broken equipment receipts." Lydia set the contract aside carefully. "You need a proper filing system. Half your legal documents are scattered across this ranch like Easter eggs. So organize them." "I am, but it would help if you stopped throwing important papers in random boxes." "I don't throw them in random boxes. They fall into random boxes naturally." Lydia looked up at him, ready to argue, and found him smiling. Actually smiling, a rare expression that transformed his usually serious face into something almost handsome. The smile caught her off guard, and she felt her cheeks warm. "That's not how papers work," she said, flustered. "Apparently it's how my papers work." Caleb pulled up a chair beside her. "Show me what else you found." They spent the next 2 hours going through documents, Lydia explaining the legal implications while Caleb asked surprisingly insightful questions. At some point, he'd moved close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and Lydia found herself acutely aware of his presence. The smell of leather and horses, the warmth radiating from his body, the way his voice dropped lower when he was concentrating. It wasn't attraction. She wouldn't let it be attraction. But it was something. When they finally finished sorting the documents, it was nearly midnight. Caleb stood and stretched, his shirt pulling tight across his shoulders. "I should let you sleep," he said. "I should probably sleep in general, Lydia agreed, but neither of them moved toward the door. Lydia, Caleb said after a moment, his voice careful, what we're doing here, building something together, it's more than I expected. More than you wanted? Different from what I wanted. He met her eyes. Better, maybe, in ways I didn't expect. The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning Lydia didn't quite dare to examine. Before she could respond, Caleb cleared his throat and moved toward the door. "Good night," he said quietly. "Good night." He paused at the threshold, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't read. Then he was gone, and Lydia was left alone with a racing heart, and the dangerous feeling that maybe, just maybe, this marriage might become something more than survival. She crushed the thought immediately. Hope was dangerous. Hope led to disappointment, and she'd had enough disappointment to last a lifetime. But the thought kept returning anyway, stubborn as weeds. The fragile peace shattered on a Tuesday morning in late July when a fancy carriage rolled up to the ranch house, drawn by matched bay horses and dripping with expensive hardware. Lydia was in the kitchen kneading bread when she heard the commotion. Through the window, she watched a woman step down from the carriage, beautiful in the way that Clara had been beautiful, with perfect posture and expensive clothes and the kind of confidence that came from never doubting your place in the world. Clara. Lydia's hands stilled in the dough, her stomach dropping like a stone. Her sister looked radiant. The months since the wedding had clearly been kind to her. She wore a traveling suit of emerald silk with jet buttons, her hair arranged in fashionable curls beneath a feathered hat. Behind her, a man emerged from the carriage, older, distinguished, with silver at his temples and the unmistakable bearing of wealth. James Thornton, the drifter Clara had run away with, was nowhere to be seen. This man was something else entirely. Lydia didn't move as Clara swept toward the house like she owned it. The knock came sharp and imperious, and Lydia forced herself to wipe the flour from her hands and answer the door. Clara's smile was brilliant and poisonous as arsenic. "Hello, sister," she said, her voice dripping with false warmth. "Aren't you going to invite me in?" For a moment, Lydia couldn't speak. All the words she'd imagined saying to Clara, all the anger and hurt and betrayal, tangled in her throat like thorns. "What are you doing here?" she finally managed. "Is that any way to greet family?" Clara swept past her into the house without waiting for permission, her eyes cataloging everything with sharp assessment. "I came to see how you're settling into married life, and to introduce you to my husband." She gestured at the silver-haired man. "This is Edmund Hartwell. Edmund, my sister Lydia." Edmund tipped his hat politely, his eyes kind but distant. "A pleasure." Lydia's mind spun. "What happened to James Thornton?" Clara's laugh was light and careless. "Oh, that was just a bit of fun. James was sweet, but he had no prospects. When I reached Denver, I met Edmund at a hotel restaurant. He's a railroad investor, very successful, very generous. We married 2 weeks ago." The casual cruelty of it stole Lydia's breath. Clara had destroyed their family, ruined the alliance, and humiliated Lydia in front of 300 people, all for a bit of fun with a man she'd discarded the moment someone wealthier appeared. "You seem surprised," Clara said, settling onto the sofa like she was holding court. "Did you think I'd actually run off with a gambler's son?" "Please, Lydia, I'm ambitious, not stupid. I just needed an excuse to escape that dreadful wedding to Caleb Ryder." "So you used me," Lydia said quietly. "I gave you an opportunity." Clara's eyes glittered with malice disguised as sweetness. "Let's be honest. You were never going to marry otherwise. I did you a favor. Now you have a husband and a home, and all it cost you was a little public humiliation. You should be thanking me." The words hit like physical blows, each one calculated to wound. Lydia stood frozen, all her hard-won confidence crumbling under her sister's casual cruelty. "This is a lovely ranch," Clara continued, looking around with exaggerated interest. "Smaller than I expected, but charming in a rustic way. Edmund's house in Denver is much grander, of course. 3 stories, marble floors, a ballroom. We're hosting a territorial governor's dinner next month." She smiled at Lydia. "But I'm sure you're very happy here, cooking and cleaning. It suits you." "Clara," Edmund said quietly, a note of warning in his voice. "I'm just making conversation, darling." Clara turned her attention back to Lydia, and her expression shifted to something almost pitying. How is marriage treating you, sister? Is Caleb kind to you? I imagine it must be difficult being married to a man who wanted someone else, someone beautiful. There it was, the blade slipped between the ribs with surgical precision. Caleb treats me with respect, Lydia said, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to steady it. Respect, Clara repeated, as if tasting the word. How romantic. I suppose when you can't have passion or desire, respect is better than nothing. She stood, smoothing her expensive skirts. Well, we should be going. We're staying at the hotel in Redemption Bend for a few days before returning to Denver. Perhaps we'll see you at dinner sometime. If Caleb doesn't mind being seen in public with you, that is. The final blow landed perfectly, and Clara knew it. She gathered her gloves and parasol, kissed the air near Lydia's cheek with theatrical affection, and swept out of the house with Edmund trailing apologetically behind. Lydia stood in the middle of her kitchen, the one she'd scrubbed and organized and made into a home, and felt 6 weeks of hard-won progress collapse into ashes. She was the replacement, the consolation prize, the sister who'd been handed to Caleb like damaged goods with an apology note attached. Clara was right. Lydia had never been chosen. She'd been convenient, available. The only option left when the real bride disappeared. All the meals she'd cooked, all the accounts she'd balanced, all the careful work she'd done to transform this ranch. None of it changed the fundamental truth. Caleb had married her out of rebellion against his father, not because he wanted her. And now Clara was married to a wealthy railroad investor, living in a mansion, hosting governors, being everything Lydia could never be. The tears came hot and angry, and Lydia hated herself for crying. She'd survived worse than this. She'd survived years of her family's contempt. One visit from her cruel sister shouldn't be enough to destroy her. But it was different now because for 6 weeks she'd let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she was building something real. That Caleb was starting to see her as more than a convenient replacement. That she mattered. Clara had shattered that illusion with a few well-placed words, and Lydia felt the loss like a physical wound. She was still crying when Caleb came home an hour later, his face lined with exhaustion from a long day. He stopped when he saw her, his expression shifting immediately to concern. What happened? Nothing, Lydia said, wiping her face roughly. It's nothing. That's not nothing. Caleb crossed the kitchen in 3 strides. Who was here? I saw carriage tracks. My sister. The words came out bitter. She wanted to introduce me to her new husband and remind me how pathetic I am. Caleb's jaw tightened. What did she say to you? The truth. Lydia's voice broke. That I'm the replacement, the second choice, the sister who only got married because the real bride ran away. That you respect me, which is what men give to women they don't actually want. Lydia, don't. She held up a hand to stop him. Don't try to make it better. She's right. We both know she's right. You married me to spite your father, not because you chose me. Everything I've done here, the accounts, the house, the work, it doesn't change that fundamental fact. I'm still the unwanted daughter playing pretend at being a wife. The silence that followed was suffocating. Caleb stood there, his hands clenched at his sides, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. And when he finally spoke, his voice was rough. Is that what you think? That you're just playing pretend? Aren't I? Lydia met his eyes, her own still wet with tears. Tell me honestly, Caleb, if Clara had shown up at that church, would you have married me instead? If you'd had the choice between your beautiful bride and the fat sister nobody wanted, which would you have chosen? The hesitation was answer enough. It lasted only a second, but Lydia saw it. The flicker of uncertainty, the moment where he had to think about his response instead of answering immediately. That's what I thought, she said quietly, and turned away before he could see her start crying again. Lydia, wait! But she was already walking toward the stairs, toward the beautiful bedroom that had been prepared for another woman, toward the lonely space that had never truly felt like hers. Behind her, Caleb stood in the kitchen with flour still dusting the counter and bread dough waiting to be baked. And for the first time since the wedding, he looked completely lost. The distance between them that night felt like a canyon that no bridge could cross. Lydia didn't come down for dinner. Caleb stood in the kitchen staring at the abandoned bread dough, at the flour-dusted counter, at the evidence of work interrupted by cruelty. He'd never been good with words. never known how to navigate the complicated terrain of emotion. On the ranch, problems were simple. A broken fence needed mending, a sick calf needed medicine, a debt needed paying. But this was different. This was a wound he didn't know how to fix, inflicted by words he couldn't take back because he'd never spoken them in the first place. His hesitation had been answer enough. He climbed the stairs twice that evening, stood outside her door with his hand raised to knock, and both times walked away without making a sound. What could he say? That he was sorry? That Clara was wrong? But Clara wasn't entirely wrong, and they both knew it. He had expected someone else in that church. He had married Lydia out of rebellion, not choice. The fact that something had shifted in the weeks since, that he'd started to see her differently, to value her presence, to look forward to their morning conversations over coffee, didn't erase the truth of how they'd begun. Caleb spent that night in his office, nursing whiskey and staring at the ledgers Lydia had so carefully organized. Every page was a testament to her competence, her intelligence, her quiet determination to transform disaster into something functional. She'd saved his ranch from bankruptcy in 6 weeks. She'd made his chaotic house into a home. She'd given him partnership when he'd offered her nothing but a name and a roof. And he'd repaid her by hesitating when she asked if he would have chosen her. The whiskey burned going down, but not as much as the shame. The next 3 days passed in suffocating silence. Lydia emerged from her room only when Caleb was out working the ranch. She cooked meals and left them covered on the stove. She continued working on the accounts, but she did it in her bedroom now, the door firmly closed. They existed in the same house like ghosts haunting separate wings of a mansion, close enough to feel each other's presence but too far apart to bridge the gap. Caleb tried once, on the second day, catching her in the hallway as she carried an armful of ledgers. "Lydia, we need to talk." "About what?" Her voice was polite and distant, the tone she might use with a stranger asking for directions. "About what your sister said. About what you think this marriage is." "I think this marriage is exactly what it's always been." Lydia shifted the ledgers in her arms, not meeting his eyes. "A business arrangement. I fix your accounts, you provide me a home. Nothing has changed." "Everything has changed," Caleb said, more forcefully than he intended. "We both know it has." "Do we?" Now she looked at him, and her eyes were red-rimmed from crying, but completely dry. "Because from where I'm standing, Clara just reminded me of the truth I'd been stupid enough to forget. I'm convenient, useful, but I was never chosen, and I never will be." "That's not fair." "Fair?" Lydia's laugh was sharp and humorless. "You want to talk about fair?" "Nothing about this situation is fair, Caleb. Not for you, not for me. But at least we can be honest about what it is. You needed a wife to spite your father. I needed an escape from mine. We're using each other. That's the deal. Let's not pretend it's anything more." She walked past him before he could respond, her shoulder brushing his arm, and disappeared into her bedroom. The door closed with a soft click that felt louder than a slam. Caleb stood in the empty hallway and realized he'd just lost something he hadn't known he valued until it was gone. On the 4th day after Clara's visit, Elias Ryder came to destroy them both. Lydia was in the kitchen preserving tomatoes when she heard the sound of multiple horses approaching. Through the window, she saw 5 riders coming up the road. Elias Ryder in the lead, flanked by 2 men in suits and a woman in an expensive traveling dress. The 5th rider was a young ranch hand leading a pack horse loaded with luggage. Every instinct Lydia possessed screamed danger. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out onto the porch just as Caleb emerged from the barn, his face going hard when he saw his father. "What do you want?" Caleb's voice carried across the yard, cold and unwelcoming. Elias dismounted with the fluid grace of a man 20 years younger, his eyes sweeping over the ranch with calculating assessment. "Is that any way to greet your father? I've come to check on my investment." "This ranch isn't your investment. It's mine." "Wait, is it?" Elias smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "We'll see about that." He gestured to the men in suits. "This is Judge Whitmore and Attorney Morrison. They've come to help me rectify a terrible mistake." The judge was a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the permanently disapproving expression of someone who'd spent decades passing judgment on others. The attorney was younger, sharper, with the predatory look of a man who enjoyed legal combat. And the woman— Lydia's stomach clenched when she looked at the woman. She was beautiful in the classical sense, with golden hair and delicate features, wearing a dove-gray traveling suit that probably cost more than Lydia earned in a year. She looked at Caleb with an expression of gentle sympathy, as if she was here to rescue him from some terrible fate. "And this," Elias continued, his voice dripping with satisfaction, "is Miss Victoria Ashworth, daughter of the Territorial Railroad Commissioner, well-educated, accomplished, and everything a rancher's wife should be." The implication hit like a sledgehammer. Lydia felt the blood drain from her face. Caleb's hands clenched into fists. "Get off my property." "It's not your property," Elias said calmly. "Not entirely. You seem to have forgotten that I own 40% of this ranch, and as a partial owner I have every right to be here." He turned to the judge. "Shall we discuss the matter inside? I'm sure Caleb will want to hear this in private." "There's nothing to discuss," Caleb said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "Whatever you're planning, it won't work. I'm planning to save you from the biggest mistake of your life." Elias started toward the house, the judge and attorney following. "You can listen like a reasonable man, or you can be stubborn and lose everything. Your choice." Victoria Ashworth dismounted gracefully and approached Caleb with practiced concern. "Mr. Ryder, I hope you understand I'm only here because your father asked me to come. I have no desire to cause trouble." Her voice was like honey, sweet and refined. Everything about her screamed breeding, education, social grace. She was exactly what the Ryders should have gotten in a daughter-in-law. And standing next to her, Lydia felt like a potato sack stuffed with shame. Caleb looked at Lydia for the first time in days, and what she saw in his eyes made her want to disappear. Fear and uncertainty, and the terrible awareness that his father had just played a winning hand. "Go inside," Lydia said quietly. "Hear what he has to say." "Lydia, go." She forced steel into her voice. "I'll finish the preserving." She turned and walked back into the kitchen before she could see his response, before her carefully constructed composure could crack. Through the window, she watched them all file into the house. Elias with his triumphant stride, the judge and attorney with their legal briefcases, Victoria with her graceful concern, and finally Caleb, looking like a man walking to his execution. Lydia's hand shook as she returned to the tomatoes, but she forced herself to keep working. The familiar rhythm of the task gave her something to focus on besides the conversation happening in the next room. The voices started out muffled but grew louder as tempers rose. Lydia couldn't make out individual words, but she didn't need to. She knew exactly what was happening. Elias was laying out his case. The marriage was invalid, rushed, improper. Victoria was the proper choice, the right match, the solution to all of Caleb's problems. And there would be consequences if Caleb refused. Legal consequences, financial consequences, the kind that could strip a man of everything he owned. 20 minutes later, the kitchen door swung open and Elias entered with the judge and attorney, leaving Caleb in the other room with Victoria. Lydia kept her eyes on the tomatoes, refusing to acknowledge them. "Mrs. Ryder," Elias said, his voice mockingly polite. "Or should I say Miss Miller, since that's what you'll be again very shortly." "Get out of my kitchen." "Your kitchen?" Elias laughed. "Nothing in this house is yours, girl. You were a convenience, a substitute, and now that convenience has become a liability." Lydia's knife slipped, cutting her finger. Blood welled up bright against her skin, but she didn't flinch. She set down the knife carefully and turned to face Elias, wrapping her bleeding finger in a dish towel. "What do you want?" "I want to correct my son's mistake." Elias stepped closer, and Lydia fought the urge to back away. "Judge Whitmore has reviewed the circumstances of your marriage and found several irregularities that make it eligible for annulment. The rushed ceremony, the bride substitution, the lack of proper consent documentation. It's quite simple, really." Judge Whitmore cleared his throat. "The law is very clear on these matters, Mrs. Ryder. A marriage conducted under false pretenses, without the full knowledge and consent of both parties regarding the actual identity of the bride, can be declared null and void. Your sister was the contracted bride. You were substituted without Mr. Ryder's prior knowledge or consent. That constitutes deception under territorial law." "I didn't deceive anyone," Lydia said, her voice shaking. "Everyone in that church knew exactly who I was." "But did Mr. Ryder agree to marry you specifically?" Attorney Morrison interjected smoothly. Or did he agree to a marriage contract that specified Clara Miller? The legal distinction is important. He agreed in front of 300 witnesses. Under duress, Elias said, to spite me, not because he actually wanted you. He leaned against the counter, his expression almost pitying. Come now, girl. You know you were never the intended bride. You know this whole situation is a farce. Why fight it? Accept the annulment gracefully, and I'll make sure you're compensated. $500, enough to start over somewhere far from here. The offer was an insult disguised as generosity, and they all knew it. And if I refuse? Lydia asked. Then things become unpleasant. Elias's voice hardened. I own 40% of this ranch. If Caleb refuses the annulment, I will call in every debt he owes me, and there are many. I will invoke my ownership rights and force a partition sale. The ranch will be divided and sold at auction, and Caleb will lose everything his grandfather built, all because he was too stubborn to admit he made a mistake marrying a woman who was never meant to be his wife. The threat was clear and devastating. Caleb would lose the ranch if he stayed married to her. Everything he'd worked for, everything that mattered to him, would be destroyed because he'd chosen to defy his father. You're bluffing, Lydia said, but her voice lacked conviction. Am I? Elias pulled a stack of papers from his coat. Here are the loan documents Caleb signed when he was 25. Here are the partnership agreements that give me controlling interest in all major ranch decisions. Here are the property deeds showing my ownership stake. I've been patient with my son's rebellion, but my patience has limits. He can have the ranch, or he can have you. He cannot have both. Judge Whitmore stepped forward, his expression grave. Mrs. Ryder, I understand this is difficult, but you must see reason. An annulment would be best for everyone. Mr. Ryder can marry Miss Ashworth as was always intended, securing his ranch and his future. You can take the compensation and make a fresh start. No one needs to suffer unnecessarily. Lydia looked at the three men standing in her kitchen, the father, the judge, the lawyer, all so certain of their power, so confident in their ability to erase her like a mistake in a ledger. And she realized with crystalline clarity that they were probably right. She was the obstacle, the inconvenient wife who stood between Caleb and everything he needed. If she truly cared about him, if she truly valued what they'd been building together, the right thing to do would be to step aside, to take the annulment and disappear before she destroyed his life completely. The dish towel around her finger was soaked with blood now. She unwrapped it slowly, looking at the cut, not deep, but painful. A small wound that hurt more than it should, like this marriage. I need to speak with Caleb, Lydia said quietly. That won't be necessary, Elias said. He's making his decision right now with Miss Ashworth. I'm sure you can guess what that decision will be. Through the doorway, Lydia could see into the sitting room where Caleb stood with Victoria. The beautiful blonde woman was speaking earnestly, her hand resting lightly on Caleb's arm. The gesture was intimate, familiar, the touch of someone who belonged in his world in a way Lydia never would. Caleb's face was turned away, so Lydia couldn't see his expression. But she could see the rigid set of his shoulders, the tension in his stance. He looked trapped, because he was trapped. Between his father's ultimatum and a wife he'd never chosen, between his ranch and a marriage born from spite, between duty and whatever complicated feelings might have developed over 6 weeks of shared meals and morning coffee. Lydia made her decision. I'll sign the annulment papers, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias smiled like a wolf. A wise choice. On one condition. Lydia forced herself to meet his eyes. You let Caleb keep the ranch. All of it. You sign over your ownership stake and forgive the debts. He gets everything free and clear. That's not how this works. That's exactly how this works. Lydia's voice grew stronger. Because if you force him to choose between me and the ranch, he'll choose the ranch. But he'll hate you for it, and he'll spend the rest of his life resenting that choice. You'll win, but you'll lose your son completely. Is that what you want? The silence that followed was electric with tension. But if you let him keep the ranch, Lydia continued, if you make this easy instead of cruel, he might forgive you eventually. He might actually have a relationship with you instead of spending decades hating the father who destroyed the one thing he loved. Elias studied her with new interest, reassessing. You're smarter than you look. I've always been smart, Lydia said. People just don't notice because I'm not pretty. No, Elias agreed. You're not, but you are clever. I'll give you that. He considered her proposal, his eyes calculating. You'll sign the annulment papers today? No fuss, no scandal, no dramatic scenes. Today, Lydia confirmed, if you sign the ownership transfer. And you'll disappear? Leave the territory? The question hit harder than Lydia expected. Leave Wyoming. Leave the only home she'd ever known. But what was there to stay for? Her family despised her. Her husband had never truly wanted her, and Clara was right. She'd always be the replacement, the second choice, the sister who only mattered when the real bride vanished. I'll leave, Lydia said. Done. Elias turned to the attorney. Draw up the papers, both sets. We'll finish this before sunset. Attorney Morrison opened his briefcase and began preparing documents with practiced efficiency. Judge Whitmore watched with judicial detachment, already mentally composing the official declaration that would erase Lydia's marriage as if it had never existed. Lydia walked to the doorway and looked into the sitting room one last time. Caleb had moved away from Victoria now, standing by the window with his back to the room. His shoulders were hunched, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He looked defeated. She wanted to go to him. She wanted to tell him that she understood, that this wasn't his fault, that she didn't blame him for choosing his ranch over a wife he'd never wanted. She wanted to say that the last 6 weeks had meant something to her, that the morning conversations and shared work and growing partnership had been the closest thing to happiness she'd ever known. But what good would it do? It would only make leaving harder. So Lydia turned away and went upstairs to pack. Her belongings fit into the same 2 trunks she'd brought from her father's house. Plain dresses, practical shoes, the books she'd read on agricultural economics and contract law. No jewelry, no fancy clothes, nothing of value except the knowledge in her head and the wounded pride in her heart. She was folding her last dress when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, familiar. Caleb. The door opened without a knock. He stood in the doorway looking wrecked, his hair disheveled like he'd been running his hands through it, his face pale, his eyes dark with something that looked like desperation. What are you doing? His voice was rough. Packing. Lydia kept folding, not trusting herself to look at him. Your father and I reached an agreement. I'm signing the annulment papers. You get to keep your ranch. The hell you are. Caleb, don't make this harder than it needs to be. Harder? He crossed the room in 3 strides and grabbed the dress from her hands. You're leaving and you think I'm making it harder? What else am I supposed to do? Lydia's control finally cracked. Stay here and watch you marry Victoria Ashworth, become the embarrassing first wife everyone whispers about? Or maybe I should stay and let your father destroy the ranch out of spite so you can spend the rest of your life resenting me for ruining everything. Is that what you think? Caleb threw the dress on the bed. That I'd resent you? Wouldn't you? Lydia's voice broke. Be honest, Caleb, really honest. If you lose this ranch because of me, because you were too stubborn to admit this marriage was a mistake, will you really be able to look at me in 10 years and not hate me for it? The question hung between them like a blade. I don't know, Caleb said finally, and the honesty was devastating. I don't know what I'll feel in 10 years. I don't know if I can lose this ranch and not blame you. I don't know if I'm strong enough to choose you over everything my grandfather built. Lydia's eyes filled with tears. Then I'm making the choice for both of us. I'm leaving. You keep the ranch. Everyone gets what they want. I don't want this. You don't want to lose your ranch, Lydia corrected, and you shouldn't have to. This is the right thing to do, Caleb. We both know it. The right thing? Caleb's laugh was bitter. The right thing would have been refusing to marry you in that church. The right thing would have been walking away instead of using you as a weapon against my father. The right thing would have been a lot of things I didn't do. But I married you, Lydia. I made vows, and I'm not going to break them just because my father showed up with legal threats and a pretty replacement. Why? The word burst out of Lydia, raw and desperate. Why are you fighting this? You never wanted me. You wanted Clara, or someone like her. You got stuck with me because I was convenient. Why throw everything away for a marriage that was never real? Because it became real. Caleb's voice cracked with emotion. Somewhere between the ledgers and the coffee and the late nights going through documents, it became real. You became real. And I know I don't deserve you. I know I hesitated when you asked if I would have chosen you. But I'm choosing you now, right now. I'm choosing you over the ranch, over my father's approval, over everything. The words hit Lydia like a physical force. She stared at Caleb, searching his face for deception or duty or pity. She found none of those things. What she found was fear and determination, and something that looked dangerously close to the emotion she'd been too afraid to name. "You can't," she whispered. "You'll lose everything." "Then I'll lose everything." Caleb took her hands, his calloused palms warm against her cold fingers. "But I won't lose you, not like this. Not because my father threatened me and you decided to sacrifice yourself to save me. Caleb, listen to me." He squeezed her hands hard enough to hurt. "I didn't choose you in that church. You're right about that. I chose revenge against my father. But I'm choosing you now, Lydia. I'm choosing the woman who fixed my disaster of a ranch. I'm choosing the woman who makes coffee at dawn and works until midnight. I'm choosing the woman who's smarter than anyone gives her credit for and stronger than she knows. I'm choosing you." Tears streamed down Lydia's face. "Why?" "Because you're the only person in that church who looked as terrified as I felt," Caleb said quietly. "And because in 6 weeks, you've become the strongest person in my life. And because I don't want to spend the next 10 years wondering what might have happened if I'd been brave enough to fight for you." Downstairs, someone called out. Elias's voice, impatient and commanding. "Are the papers ready? Where's the girl?" Caleb didn't move. He stood there holding Lydia's hands, his eyes locked on hers, waiting for her answer. "If we do this," Lydia said slowly, "if you refuse the annulment, your father will destroy you. He'll take the ranch. He'll ruin your reputation. He'll make sure everyone knows you chose an unwanted wife over your own future." "Let him try," Caleb said. "I'm done being afraid of him." "Caleb!" Elias's voice was closer now, coming up the stairs. "Where are you?" Lydia looked at the man standing before her, this stranger who'd become her husband, who'd married her out of spite, and somewhere along the way started to see her as more than a weapon or a convenience. She thought about the morning conversations, the shared work, the slowly building partnership that had started to feel like something deeper. She thought about leaving this ranch, this house, this life she'd just started to build. And she thought about staying. The door burst open and Elias stood there, his face dark with fury. "What's going on? The papers are ready. Sign them and let's finish this farce." Caleb turned to face his father, his hand still gripping Lydia's. "No." "No?" Elias's voice was dangerously quiet. "No," Caleb repeated, stronger this time. "I'm not signing anything. I'm not annulling my marriage, and I'm not letting you destroy what I've built here just because you can't control me anymore." Elias's face went purple with rage. "You ungrateful fool! Do you have any idea what you're throwing away? The ranch, your inheritance, your future, all for this woman who was never meant to be yours." "She's mine now," Caleb said simply. "And I'm keeping her." The explosion that followed Caleb's declaration shook the entire house. Elias Ryder's face transformed from purple rage into something colder and more dangerous. The expression of a man who'd spent 40 years crushing opposition and had no intention of stopping now. He stepped fully into the bedroom, the judge and attorney flanking him like soldiers backing a general into battle. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life," Elias said, his voice deadly quiet. "I gave you a chance to fix this gracefully, to save yourself and this pathetic excuse for a ranch. But if you're too stubborn to see reason, then I'll do what I should have done months ago." "Which is what?" Caleb's hand tightened around Lydia's. "Threaten me? You've been threatening me my whole life. It's gotten old." "No threats. Action." Elias turned to Attorney Morrison. "File the partition lawsuit tomorrow. I want this ranch divided and sold within 60 days. "You can't do that," Lydia said, finding her voice. "Caleb owns 60%. I can and I will." Elias wheeled on her, his eyes blazing. Under territorial law, any co-owner can force a partition sale if they believe the partnership is no longer viable. And this partnership stopped being viable the moment my son married you. Judge Whitmore has already agreed to fast-track the case. Judge Whitmore adjusted his spectacles, looking uncomfortable but resolute. The law is clear, Mrs. Ryder. When co-owners cannot agree on management decisions, either party can petition for partition. Given the circumstances of this marriage and the clear conflict it's created, I see no reason to delay proceedings. The circumstances? Lydia's voice rose. You mean the fact that Caleb married someone you didn't approve of? That's not a legal basis for destroying his property. The legal basis, Attorney Morrison interjected smoothly, is that Mr. Elias Ryder and Mr. Caleb Ryder have fundamental disagreements about the ranch's future direction. The marriage is simply evidence of Mr. Caleb Ryder's impaired judgment and inability to make sound business decisions. Impaired judgment? Caleb's voice was dangerous now. I turned this ranch around in 6 weeks. The accounts are balanced for the first time in years. The feed costs are down 30%. We're actually profitable. Because of her, Elias gestured dismissively at Lydia. Because she's doing the work you should have been doing all along. But that doesn't change the fundamental problem. You chose this woman over your family's interests, over the alliances we need, over everything I've worked to build. You mean everything you've worked to control? But Caleb shot back. This was never about the ranch's success. It was about making sure I stayed under your thumb. Well, I'm done. Sue me. Force the sale. Do whatever you think you need to do. But I'm not annulling my marriage, and I'm not marrying Victoria Ashworth or anyone else you parade in front of me. Downstairs, a feminine voice called out hesitantly, Mr. Ryder, is everything all right? Victoria had apparently grown tired of waiting in the sitting room. Her footsteps sounded on the stairs, light and graceful, and moments later she appeared in the doorway. Her eyes took in the scene. Caleb and Lydia standing together, hands clasped, facing down Elias and his legal army, and her expression shifted to wounded confusion. I don't understand, Victoria said softly. Mr. Ryder, your father said you wanted to meet me, that you were looking for a way to resolve this unfortunate situation. My father lied, Caleb said bluntly. I never asked to meet you. I never agreed to any of this. I'm sorry you were dragged into this mess, but I'm married, legally and by choice. That's not changing. Victoria's cheeks flushed. But surely you can see how impossible this situation is. How can you build a future with a woman who was never meant to be your wife? Your father told me the whole story, how her sister abandoned you, how you were forced into this marriage. I wasn't forced, Caleb interrupted. I chose it. Maybe not for the right reasons at first, but I chose it, and I'm choosing to stay in it now. Because she's trapped you somehow. Victoria looked at Lydia with something close to pity. I understand desperation, truly I do. But manipulating a man into staying married when he clearly needs to be free, I haven't manipulated anyone, Lydia said, her voice shaking with anger. I tried to leave. I was packing when Caleb stopped me. This isn't manipulation, it's his choice. A choice he's making because you've made yourself indispensable, Elias said. Managing his accounts, running his household, making yourself so useful he feels obligated to keep you. That's manipulation, girl. Just a different kind. The accusation hit Lydia like a slap. Was that what she'd done? Made herself so necessary that Caleb felt trapped by obligation rather than desire? She looked at him, searching his face for the truth. Is that what you think? She asked quietly. That I manipulated you? No, Caleb said firmly. You worked hard and did your job. If that makes you manipulative, then every competent person in the territory is guilty of the same thing. But you do feel obligated, Lydia pressed. Don't you? You feel like you owe me something because I fixed your accounts and your house and your finances. That's not the same as wanting me. Lydia, be honest, her voice cracked. If I hadn't made myself useful, would you still be fighting for this marriage? Or would you have signed those annulment papers the moment your father presented them? The question hung in the air like a noose. Caleb opened his mouth, closed it, struggled visibly with the answer. And in that struggle, Lydia saw the truth she'd been afraid to acknowledge. He was fighting for her. But he was also fighting against his father, and she couldn't tell where one motivation ended and the other began. That's what I thought, she said softly, and pulled her hand from his. No, that's not... Caleb reached for her, but Lydia stepped back. You're twisting this. making it about obligation when it's not. Then what is it? Lydia demanded. Tell me exactly what this is, Caleb, because from where I'm standing, I see a man who spent his whole life being controlled by his father, and now he's found a new way to rebel. I'm not a wife. I'm a weapon. I was a weapon in that church, and I'm still a weapon now. The only difference is you've convinced yourself it's something more. That's not true. Isn't it? Lydia's voice rose. You never wanted me. You still don't want me. You want freedom from your father. You want to prove you can make your own choices. But wanting those things doesn't mean you actually want me. The words came out harsh and raw, scraping her throat like broken glass. But they needed to be said. Because Lydia was done being the convenient solution to other people's problems. She'd been the convenient daughter when Clara ran away. She'd been the convenient wife when Caleb needed to spite his father. And she was tired of being chosen for what she could provide rather than who she was. Victoria moved into the room with practiced grace, her hand reaching out to touch Caleb's arm in a gesture of gentle sympathy. Perhaps we should all take a moment to calm down. These are difficult circumstances, and emotions are running high. No one needs to make any permanent decisions today. The decision's already made, Elias said. Caleb can accept reality now, or he can fight and lose everything. Those are his only options. There's a third option, a new voice said from the doorway. Everyone turned. Sarah Donnelly, the housekeeper who came twice a week from town, stood in the hallway holding a market basket. She was a stout woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd raised 6 children and buried 2 husbands. She looked at the crowd in the bedroom with frank disapproval. Mrs. Donnelly, Caleb said, clearly surprised. I didn't hear you arrive. Obviously. I came to bring the supplies you ordered, and I walk in to find this circus. She set down the basket with a thump. Judge Whitmore, I'm ashamed of you, taking Elias Ryder's money to fast-track a case that has no legal merit. The judge stiffened. I beg your pardon. You should beg someone's pardon, but it's not mine. Sarah walked into the room like she owned it. I was at that wedding. I saw exactly what happened. Caleb Ryder married Lydia Miller in front of 300 witnesses. The Reverend asked if there were any objections. Nobody objected. The vows were spoken clearly and without coercion. That's a legal marriage by any standard, and you know it. The circumstances were irregular, Attorney Morrison began. The circumstances were unusual, Sarah interrupted. Not illegal. There's a difference. And if you try to claim otherwise, every newspaper in the territory will print the story of how Elias Ryder tried to bully his son out of a legal marriage because he didn't like the bride. Is that the publicity you want, Elias? Because I promise you I know every editor from here to Denver. Elias's face darkened. This is none of your concern, woman. It's every decent person's concern when a father tries to destroy his son's life out of spite. Sarah turned to Lydia. And you. Stop packing. This is your home now. You earned it. I didn't earn anything, Lydia said quietly. I was just trying to survive. Surviving is earning it. Sarah's voice softened. I've watched you these past weeks. Seen how hard you work, how much you've improved this place. You belong here more than half the people in this room. She looked pointedly at Victoria. No offense, miss, but you're a stranger here. Lydia's the one who's been building this ranch into something worth having. Victoria's perfect composure finally cracked. I came here as a favor to Mr. Ryder's father. I was told this marriage was a mistake that needed correcting. If I've caused offense, it wasn't intentional. The offense is Elias's, Sarah said bluntly. Not yours. But you should know you're being used as a pawn in a man's vendetta against his own son. Is that really how you want to start a marriage? As a replacement bride in someone else's battle? Victoria's face went pale. She looked at Elias, then at Caleb, then at the door. I think I should leave. You're not going anywhere, Elias commanded. We're not finished here. I am. Victoria gathered her skirts with dignity. I agreed to come here believing I was helping resolve a genuine problem. I didn't realize I was being used to punish a son for daring to make his own choices. I'm sorry, Mr. Ryder, Sr., but I won't be part of this. She looked at Caleb. I wish you well. Truly. She left the room with her head high, her departure creating a vacuum of shocked silence. They could hear her footsteps on the stairs, the front door opening and closing, the sound of her calling for her driver. Elias stood frozen, clearly not having expected his perfect replacement bride to walk away. Attorney Morrison shifted uncomfortably. Judge Whitmore cleared his throat and suddenly found the floor fascinating. "This changes nothing," Elias said finally, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "With or without Victoria, the legal case stands. I'll force the partition sale, Caleb. I'll take everything you have." "Then you'll have to do it publicly," Sarah said, "at the town meeting tomorrow night, when everyone can hear exactly what you're doing and why." "What town meeting?" Elias demanded. "The emergency meeting the mayor just called," Sarah said calmly, "about the Ryder Ranch dispute. It's all over town already. The drama of Elias Ryder bringing lawyers and a replacement bride to force his son out of a legal marriage. People are talking, they want answers, and the mayor wants everything handled transparently in front of the whole community." Lydia's heart sank. A public meeting meant 300 more people witnessing her humiliation. It meant standing in front of the entire town while Elias laid out every reason why she wasn't good enough for his son. It meant reliving the wedding all over again, except this time everyone would be judging whether the marriage should be dissolved. "I won't do it," she said. "I won't stand in front of the whole town and be examined like a piece of livestock." "You won't have to," Caleb said. "I'll speak. I'll explain everything." "And say what?" Lydia turned on him. "That you married me to spite your father? That you're keeping me because I'm useful? That you're fighting this annulment not because you actually want to be married to me, but because you're tired of being controlled?" "I'll say the truth," Caleb said quietly. "Whatever that is." "The truth is you don't know what you want," Lydia said, and she was crying now, hot, angry tears she couldn't stop. "You don't know if you're fighting for me or against your father. You don't know if this marriage is real or just convenient. You don't know anything except that you're tired of being told what to do. Well, I'm tired too. I'm tired of being the solution to everyone else's problems. I'm tired of being chosen for what I can do instead of who I am. And I'm tired of pretending that any of this is about me when it's really just about you and your father fighting for control." The words hit Caleb like physical blows. His face went pale, his jaw clenched, and for a long moment he couldn't seem to find any response. "If that's what you think," he said finally, his voice rough, "then maybe you should sign those papers. Maybe you're right. Maybe I don't know what I want. But I know I don't want you to stay if you believe I'm just using you." The admission felt like the ground opening beneath Lydia's feet. She'd pushed him, demanded honesty, and he'd given it to her. But instead of clarity, she felt only more confused, more hurt, more lost. "Everyone out!" Sarah commanded suddenly, her voice cutting through the tension. "This is between Caleb and Lydia. The rest of you need to leave. Now." "We're not finished," Elias started. "Yes, you are. For today, anyway." Sarah physically started herding people toward the door. "Judge, attorney, you can present your case tomorrow night at the town meeting if you still think you have one. Elias, you can go back to your hotel and think about whether destroying your son is really worth whatever pride you're trying to salvage. Everyone out. Go!" To Lydia's surprise, they went. Perhaps it was Sarah's commanding presence, or perhaps they'd all realized that nothing more would be accomplished here today. But one by one, they filed out of the bedroom, the judge looking relieved, the attorney looking frustrated, Elias looking like a volcano preparing to erupt. When the house finally fell silent, except for Sarah's footsteps downstairs, Lydia and Caleb stood on opposite sides of the room like strangers again. All the closeness they'd built over 6 weeks had evaporated, leaving only the awkward distance of two people who didn't know how to navigate the space between obligation and choice. "I should finish packing," Lydia said quietly. "Are you leaving?" "I don't know." She sank onto the bed, exhausted. "I don't know anything anymore. I don't know if I should stay or go. I don't know if this marriage is real or just convenient. I don't know if you want me or just want to defy your father. I don't know any of it." Caleb crossed the room slowly and sat beside her on the bed, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body. "I don't know either," he admitted. "I don't know how to separate what I feel for you from what I feel about my father. I don't know if I'm fighting for you or just fighting against him. All I know is that when you said you were leaving, something in my chest felt like it was breaking, and when I thought about you signing those papers and disappearing, I couldn't breathe." That's fear of loss, Lydia said, not love. Maybe, or maybe it's both. Caleb's voice was raw with honesty. Maybe I'm terrified of losing you, and terrified of admitting I care about you, and terrified that if I let myself feel too much, you'll leave anyway because I'm not good enough at this. At marriage, at feelings, at any of it. Lydia looked at him, really looked at him, and saw her own fear reflected back. Two people who'd been taught their whole lives that they weren't good enough, thrown together by scandal, trying to build something real out of spite and necessity, and the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, they could be enough for each other. "What are we doing, Caleb?" she asked softly. "I don't know," he said, "but I think we should figure it out together. At that town meeting tomorrow. In front of everyone. I can't stand in front of the whole town again. I can't survive another humiliation. Then we'll survive it together." Caleb finally reached for her hand. "I'll tell them the truth. All of it. How we started, where we are now, what I'm willing to fight for. And then you can decide if you want to stay or go. But at least everyone will know that this marriage, whatever it is our choice. Not my father's. Not your father's. Ours." Lydia looked at their joined hands, her fingers still stained with tomato juice, his calloused from ranch work. Two imperfect people holding on to each other in the wreckage of expectations and broken plans. "I'm scared," she whispered. "So am I," Caleb admitted, "but I'm more scared of losing you." They sat like that as the sun set beyond the window, casting long shadows across the bedroom floor. Downstairs, Sarah was banging pots in the kitchen, probably making dinner with pointed domesticity. Outside, the ranch settled into evening routines, cattle calling, horses shuffling in their stalls, the eternal rhythm of land and livestock that would continue regardless of human drama. Tomorrow would bring the town meeting, the public reckoning, the moment when everyone would judge whether their marriage deserved to survive. But tonight, they had this. Two people sitting together in an uncertain silence, holding hands and trying to find the courage to choose each other in front of a world that had already decided they didn't belong together. The next day arrived too quickly, bringing with it the kind of nervous tension that makes minutes feel like hours, and hours feel like seconds simultaneously. Lydia spent the morning preparing for battle the only way she knew how, with numbers and facts and documentation. If Elias was going to attack their marriage publicly, she would defend it with evidence. She gathered all the ranch ledgers showing the improvement she'd made, the contracts she'd renegotiated, the financial turnaround she'd engineered in 6 weeks. Let him try to claim she was useless when she had proof that she'd saved his son's ranch from bankruptcy. Caleb spent the morning writing the fence lines, ostensibly checking for damage but really just avoiding the house, and the inevitable confrontation to come. When he returned at noon, he looked haggard but determined. They ate lunch in tense silence, neither knowing what to say. Sarah had left fresh bread and cold roast beef with strict instructions to eat and keep their strength up. The food tasted like sawdust in Lydia's mouth, but she forced it down anyway. At 6 o'clock, they climbed into the wagon for the ride to town. The meeting was scheduled for 7 at the town hall, the only building in Redemption Bend large enough to hold the crowd that would inevitably gather. News of the Ryder drama had spread like wildfire. Everyone in 3 territories wanted to witness the showdown between Elias Ryder and his rebellious son. The sun was setting as they drove through the rolling prairie, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson. Under different circumstances, it would have been beautiful. Instead, it felt like riding toward their execution with a pretty backdrop. "Whatever happens tonight," Caleb said as the lights of town appeared on the horizon, "I want you to know something." Lydia waited, her heart pounding. "I don't regret it," he continued, "marrying you. Even if it all falls apart tonight, even if we lose everything, I don't regret choosing you in that church. And I don't regret choosing you again yesterday when I could have signed those papers. Even if it costs you your ranch? Even then." He looked at her, his eyes steady. "I'd rather lose land than lose my integrity. And I'd lose every bit of integrity I have if I let my father bully me into erasing a marriage just because it wasn't the one he wanted." The words settled over Lydia like a blanket, not quite warm enough to chase away all the cold, but better than nothing. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that this was about her and not just about defying Elias. But belief and trust were luxuries she'd never been able to afford, and she couldn't quite bring herself to reach for them now. Redemption Bend's town hall was blazing with light when they arrived, every window glowing gold against the darkening sky. Wagons and horses crowded the street. People clustered on the steps, talking in excited whispers. When Caleb helped Lydia down from their wagon, conversation stopped. 300 pairs of eyes turned to watch them walk toward the building. Lydia recognized faces from the wedding, people who'd laughed when her father announced the bride's substitution, people who'd whispered about the fat sister, people who'd watched her humiliation with entertainment rather than sympathy. Now they were here for round two, eager to see how the drama would resolve. Inside, the hall was packed. Every bench was full, with people standing along the walls and crowding near the doors. A long table had been set up at the front where the mayor sat flanked by 2 town council members. Elias Ryder sat on one side with his lawyer, looking calm and confident. An empty chair waited on the other side for Caleb. As they walked down the center aisle, Lydia heard the whispers following them like a wake. "That's her. The sister. Can't believe she has the nerve to show her face. Heard she trapped him with ranch work. My cousin said Elias brought a proper bride, but the girl left. This whole thing's a scandal." Lydia kept her eyes forward, her spine straight, refusing to show how much the words wounded. Beside her, Caleb's hand found hers and squeezed once, brief but firm. United. They reached the front and Caleb took his seat. There was no chair for Lydia. She stood awkwardly to the side, feeling like a defendant at a trial rather than a wife at her husband's side. Mayor Thompson, a portly man with impressive mutton chops, banged his gavel for order. The crowd settled reluctantly, still buzzing with anticipation. "We're here tonight," the mayor began, "to address the dispute between Elias Ryder and his son Caleb regarding the recent marriage and subsequent business conflicts. This is not a legal proceeding, but a public forum for both parties to present their positions. Mr. Elias Ryder, you called for this meeting. Please state your case." Elias stood, commanding the room immediately. "Thank you, Mayor. I'll be brief because the facts speak for themselves. 2 months ago, my son was supposed to marry Clara Miller, a union arranged to benefit both our families and secure important business alliances. Instead, Clara Miller ran off, and my son married her sister Lydia in what can only be described as a hasty and ill-considered decision made in the heat of the moment." He paused, letting the words sink in. Lydia felt every eye in the room on her. "Since then," Elias continued, "my son has refused to acknowledge his mistake. He's refused an annulment, despite the fact that this marriage has created serious business complications. As a 40% owner of the Ryder Ranch, I have a right to ensure the business is run properly. And I cannot do that when my son is making decisions based on emotion rather than logic." "Emotion like spite?" someone called from the crowd. Elias's jaw tightened, but he ignored the interruption. "I'm not here to attack my son's wife. I'm here to protect my investment and my family's future. The marriage was a mistake. Everyone knows it. And the honorable thing for both parties would be to acknowledge that and move forward separately." He sat down to a murmur of mixed reactions, some agreeing, some skeptical. Mayor Thompson turned to Caleb. "Mr. Ryder, your response?" Caleb stood slowly. He looked at his father, then at Lydia, then at the 300 faces staring at him with judgment and curiosity and cruel entertainment, and when he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the packed hall. "My father's right about one thing," Caleb said. "This marriage started as a mistake." Lydia's heart dropped. Around them, the crowd leaned forward, eager for the confession. "I didn't choose Lydia Miller that day because I loved her," Caleb continued. "I chose her because I was angry at my father, because I was tired of being controlled, because I wanted to prove I could make my own decisions, even if they were terrible ones. I married her out of spite and rebellion and nothing that resembled actual affection." The admission fell like stones, each word a blow. Lydia wanted to run, to escape, to be anywhere but standing in front of 300 people while her husband admitted their marriage was a weapon, not a choice. But then Caleb turned and looked directly at her. "That's how it started," he said quietly. "But that's not how it is now." The silence in the town hall was absolute. 300 people held their breath, waiting for Caleb's next words. Lydia stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs, terrified of what he would say, and even more terrified of what he wouldn't. Caleb kept his eyes locked on hers as he continued, his voice steady and clear. In the past 6 weeks, Lydia has done something I didn't think was possible. She took my failing ranch and turned it around. She balanced accounts I'd been ignoring for months. She renegotiated contracts that were bleeding us dry. She cut our operating costs by 30% and put us on track to actually turn a profit for the first time in 2 years. He turned to address the crowd. But that's not why I'm fighting to keep this marriage. I'm not fighting for her because she's useful or convenient or good at managing ledgers. I'm fighting for her because somewhere between the burnt coffee and the late nights going through documents and the quiet meals where we barely spoke, I started to see her. Really see her. Not as a weapon against my father, not as a replacement for the bride who ran away, but as a woman who's stronger and smarter and braver than anyone in this room gave her credit for. Lydia's vision blurred with tears. She blinked them back furiously, refusing to cry in front of these people again. My father says this marriage was a mistake, Caleb continued, his voice growing stronger. And maybe it was. Maybe choosing your wife out of spite is the worst possible way to start a marriage. But I'm not standing here defending how we started. I'm standing here defending what we've become. Lydia didn't trap me. She didn't manipulate me. She worked hard and earned her place in my life and on my ranch. And if my father wants to destroy that because he's angry I didn't follow his plan, then he's going to have to do it knowing that I chose this. I chose her. Not out of spite anymore. Out of respect, out of partnership, out of... He paused, searching for the right word, and when he found it, his voice dropped to something quieter but more powerful. Out of love. The word hit the crowd like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the hall. Even Elias looked shocked. Caleb turned back to Lydia, and the raw honesty in his face stole her breath. I know I hesitated when you asked if I would have chosen you over Clara. I know I wasn't honest about what I felt because I barely understood it myself, but I'm telling you now, in front of everyone, so there's no confusion. I would choose you. Over Clara, over Victoria Ashworth, over any woman my father could parade in front of me. Because you're the only one who looked at my disaster of a life and decided to fix it instead of running away. You're the only one who saw me as more than just a rancher with land and money. And you're the only one I want to spend my life building something with. Lydia couldn't stop the tears now. They streamed down her face as she stared at this man, her husband, her unexpected partner, the stranger who'd somehow become the most important person in her world. So yes, Caleb said, his voice ringing through the hall, this marriage started wrong. But I'm making it right now, in front of everyone. I'm choosing Lydia Miller, not because I have to, because I want to. He sat down, and the silence that followed was deafening. Then someone in the back started clapping. Slow at first, then faster, then joined by others until half the room was applauding. The other half sat in stunned silence, watching the drama unfold like spectators at a prize fight who couldn't believe what they were seeing. Elias stood abruptly, his face dark with fury. That's a very pretty speech, Caleb. Very romantic. But it doesn't change the facts. You married a woman who was never meant to be your wife. You're letting emotion cloud your business judgment. And as a 40% owner of that ranch, I have every right to protect my investment from your impulsive decisions. Actually, a new voice said from the back of the room, you don't. Everyone turned. A small, neat man in a banker's suit was making his way down the aisle, carrying a leather portfolio. Lydia recognized him as Chester Whitfield, the manager of Redemption Bend Savings and Loan. Mayor Thompson looked confused. Mr. Whitfield, this is somewhat irregular. I apologize for the interruption, Mayor, but there's information relevant to this dispute that the court should hear. Chester reached the front and opened his portfolio with practiced efficiency. Information regarding the actual ownership structure of the Ryder Ranch. Elias's eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the loan restructuring that took place 3 weeks ago, Chester said calmly. When Mrs. Lydia Ryder came to my office with a proposal to renegotiate the ranch's outstanding debts. All eyes swung to Lydia. She stood very still, her heart pounding. Chester continued, reading from a document. Mrs. Ryder presented a comprehensive financial analysis showing the ranch's improved position and requested better loan terms. During that meeting, we discovered an interesting clause in the original partnership agreement between Elias Ryder and his son. What clause? Attorney Morrison demanded, leaning forward. The clause stating that once Caleb Ryder married and assumed full operational control of the ranch, ownership would automatically transfer to 60% Caleb, 40% his spouse, with Elias Ryder's share being bought out over time through structured payments. Chester looked up from the document. The marriage triggered that transfer. As of June 14th, Elias Ryder no longer owns any portion of the ranch. The room exploded. Elias lunged forward, his face purple with rage. That's a lie. I own 40%. You did own 40%, Chester corrected calmly, until your son married. The agreement was drafted by your own attorney 20 years ago when you gave Caleb operational control. The marriage clause was your idea, Mr. Ryder. You wanted to ensure that when Caleb married, he would be financially independent and capable of supporting a family. Let me see that document, Judge Whitmore demanded. Chester handed over the papers. The judge read them carefully, his expression growing more grave with each line. Finally, he looked up at Elias. He's right. The clause is here in black and white. Marriage triggers ownership transfer and buyout. The terms are clear. Elias Ryder receives fair market value for his 40% stake to be paid over 20 years at 4% interest. Upon Caleb Ryder's marriage, full ownership transfers to Caleb and his spouse in a 60-40 split. When was this transfer finalized? Mayor Thompson asked. 3 weeks ago, Chester said. When Mrs. Ryder brought in her financial analysis, I pulled the full partnership agreement and discovered the clause. We processed the transfer immediately and sent notification to Mr. Elias Ryder's address of record. I never received any notification, Elias growled. You were traveling, Attorney Morrison said quietly, his face pale. Your mail was being held at the hotel in Cheyenne. When you came here to confront your son, you never checked it. The realization of what had happened settled over the room like snow. Elias Ryder had threatened his son with a lawsuit and a partition sale based on ownership he no longer possessed. He'd brought lawyers and a replacement bride to force an annulment that would accomplish nothing except humiliation. He'd lost his leverage 3 weeks ago and never even knew it. Elias stood frozen, his entire body rigid with the kind of rage that comes from being outmaneuvered completely. He turned slowly to look at Lydia, and the expression on his face was murderous. You knew, he said, his voice deadly quiet. You found that clause and you knew. Lydia met his gaze without flinching. I found it. I read it. I made sure it was properly executed. That's my job, managing the ranch's legal and financial interests, which, as of 3 weeks ago, became my ranch too. You manipulative little... Careful, Caleb said, standing. His voice was soft but dangerous. That's my wife you're talking about, and my business partner, and the woman who just saved our ranch from your threats. So choose your next words very carefully. Elias's hands clenched into fists. For a moment, Lydia thought he might actually strike his own son in front of the entire town, but then something in Elias seemed to collapse. Not his rage, but his certainty. The absolute conviction that he could control his son through threats and money and manipulation crumbled under the weight of legal reality. You ungrateful fool, Elias said finally, his voice hoarse. I gave you everything, built an empire for you to inherit, and this is how you repay me? By choosing some common woman who trapped you with paperwork? She didn't trap me, Caleb said. She saved me. From debt, from your control, and from becoming the kind of man who destroys his own son out of pride. If that makes me ungrateful, then I'm ungrateful. But at least I'm free. The words hung in the air between father and son, final, irrevocable, the severing of a bond that had been toxic for too long. Elias looked at Caleb for a long moment, his face cycling through emotions too complex to name. Then he turned to Attorney Morrison. Prepare the paperwork for the buyout. I want every penny I'm owed, with interest, and I want it structured so that if they miss even one payment, I get the ranch back. That's not how the agreement works, Chester started. Make it work, Elias snapped, or I'll tie them up in court for the next decade arguing every clause and comma in that document. We'll pay, Lydia said quietly. every penny, on time, with interest. You'll get what you're legally owed, Mr. Ryder. Nothing more, nothing less. Elias stared at her with something between hatred and grudging respect. You're tougher than you look. I've had to be. He nodded once, sharply, then turned and walked toward the door. The crowd parted for him like water around a stone. Attorney Morrison gathered his papers and followed, looking relieved to escape. Judge Whitmore cleared his throat awkwardly and declared the matter resolved from a legal standpoint, pending proper filing of the buyout paperwork. The crowd began to disperse, breaking into excited conversations about what they'd just witnessed. The story of the Ryder showdown would be told and retold for years. How the unwanted bride had outsmarted the most powerful rancher in Wyoming, how the rebellious son had chosen love over land, how a marriage born from scandal had somehow become the real thing. But Lydia barely heard any of it. She stood in the middle of the emptying hall, watching Caleb shake hands with the mayor and Chester Whitfield, accepting congratulations and fielding questions about the buyout terms. He looked lighter somehow, like a massive weight had been lifted from his shoulders. When he finally turned back to her, his eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. "You knew," he said, echoing his father's words. "About the ownership transfer. You knew weeks ago." "I knew," Lydia confirmed. "I found the clause when I was organizing the legal documents. I made sure it was properly executed because I wanted you to be free of him. Even if you chose to annul our marriage, I wanted you to have that freedom." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because it needed to be your choice," Lydia said simply. "If you chose me knowing you were already free of your father, it would mean something. If you chose me because you thought you needed me to escape him, it would mean nothing. I needed to know which one it was." Caleb crossed the space between them in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms. The embrace was fierce and desperate and completely inappropriate for a public building with 50 people still milling around. Lydia didn't care. She held on to him like he was the only solid thing in a world that had been spinning too fast for too long. "I love you," Caleb whispered against her hair. "I know I said it in front of everyone, but I need you to hear it again, just for you. I love you, Lydia. Not because you saved my ranch or outsmarted my father or fixed my accounts, because you're brave and smart and you see me as more than just a rancher's son who needs to be managed. You make me want to be better, and I don't know how I got so lucky, but I'm not letting you go." Lydia pulled back just enough to look at his face. "Even though I'm fat and plain and nothing like what you were supposed to have?" "Especially because you're nothing like what I was supposed to have." Caleb's smile was crooked and genuine. "Clara would have been decorative and useless. You're real, and I'll take real over decorative any day." "That's the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me," Lydia said, laughing through her tears, "which is kind of sad when you think about it." "I'll work on my romantic speeches," Caleb promised. "Give me 20 or 30 years. I'll get better at this." "A 20 or 30 years," Lydia repeated, testing the words. A lifetime, a future, everything she'd never dared to hope for. "If you'll have me," Caleb said. "I know this has been a disaster from start to finish. I know I've made mistakes and hurt you and taken too long to figure out what I wanted. But if you're willing to give me a chance to do this right, to be the husband you deserve instead of the one you got stuck with, I promise I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make you glad you stayed." Lydia looked at this man who'd married her out of spite and somehow learned to love her anyway. She thought about the 6 weeks they'd spent building something real out of scandal and necessity. She thought about morning coffee and late-night ledgers and the slow, careful growth of partnership into something deeper. And she thought about Clara, married to a wealthy railroad investor in Denver, living in a mansion and hosting governors and being everything the world said a woman should be. Clara had the beauty and the status and the fairy tale ending everyone expected. But Lydia had something better. She had a man who saw her, valued her, chose her, not because she was beautiful or charming or decorative, but because she was competent and strong and real. She had a ranch that was hers, work that mattered, a future she'd built with her own hands and brains. She had earned her place, and that was worth more than all the mansions in Denver. "Yes," Lydia said, "I'll stay. I'll give you 20 or 30 years to work on those romantic speeches. And I'll try not to be too hard on you when they're terrible." Caleb's laugh was bright with relief and joy. He kissed her then, in the middle of the town hall with witnesses still present, And it wasn't tentative or uncertain or careful. It was the kiss of a man claiming his wife in front of the world, declaring ownership not through force, but through choice. When they finally broke apart, Sarah Donnelly was standing nearby with her arms crossed and a satisfied smile on her face. "About time you two figured it out," she said. "Now get home. You have a ranch to run, and I have a kitchen that needs cleaning after all those men tramped through it yesterday." "Yes, ma'am," Caleb said, grinning. He took Lydia's hand and led her toward the door, through the remaining clusters of townspeople who watched them with expressions ranging from approval to envy to lingering disapproval. Let them think what they wanted, Lydia thought. She'd spent 23 years caring what other people thought of her, trying to earn approval she'd never receive. She was done with that. From now on, the only opinions that mattered were hers and Caleb's. The night air was cool and sweet as they stepped outside. The wagon waited where they'd left it, the horse drowsing patiently. As Caleb helped Lydia up, she noticed a figure standing in the shadows near the general store. Her father. Thomas Miller stepped into the lamplight, his face haggard and older than Lydia remembered. He approached slowly, like a man walking toward something dangerous. "Lydia," he said, his voice rough, "I need to speak with you." Caleb tensed beside her, but Lydia put a hand on his arm. "It's all right." She climbed down from the wagon and faced the man who'd slapped her and called her a burden and sold her off to save a business deal. They stood 3 feet apart, studying each other across a chasm that felt wider than the prairie. "I was wrong," Thomas said finally. The words sounded like they were being pulled from somewhere deep and painful. "About you, about Clara, about everything." Lydia waited, saying nothing. "Clara's husband left her," Thomas continued, 2 weeks after they married. Turns out he was already married to a woman in Chicago. Clara came home last week, disgraced and broke. She stole the railroad bonds from my safe to run away with that first boy, then married a bigamist who took what little money she had left and disappeared. She's back at the ranch now, crying in her room, and your mother is beside herself. Lydia felt a flicker of something that might have been sympathy, but it was distant and abstract. Clara's problems were no longer hers. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because I was wrong," Thomas repeated. "I spent 23 years valuing the wrong daughter. Clara was beautiful and charming and everything I thought a daughter should be. But she was shallow and selfish, and she nearly destroyed everything I built. While you—" He stopped, his voice breaking. "You were the one holding everything together, managing the books, running the household, keeping the ranch profitable. And I never saw it. I never valued it. I treated you like you were worthless when you were the most valuable thing I had." The apology was too late and too small for the years of damage it tried to cover. But Lydia heard the genuine regret in her father's voice, saw the broken pride in his face, and found that she didn't hate him. She just didn't need him anymore. "I forgive you," she said quietly. "Not because you deserve it, but because I don't want to carry that anger anymore. It's too heavy." Thomas's face crumpled with relief. "Thank you. I know I can't undo the past, but maybe we could start over. You could come visit. Bring Caleb. Let me try to be a better father than I was." Lydia considered the offer. 6 weeks ago, she would have leaped at the chance for her father's approval. Now it felt like something she could take or leave. "Maybe," she said, "in time, when I'm ready." "I understand." Thomas nodded, accepting the boundary she'd drawn. "I'm proud of you, Lydia, for what you've done with the Ryder Ranch, for standing up to Elias, for—" He gestured helplessly. "For being stronger than I ever gave you credit for." The words should have filled some empty place inside her. Instead, they just felt like words, nice to hear, but no longer necessary for her sense of worth. "Thank you," Lydia said simply. "I should go. My husband is waiting." "Yes, of course." Thomas stepped back, releasing her. "Take care of yourself, daughter." Lydia climbed back into the wagon beside Caleb, who'd been watching the exchange with careful attention. As they pulled away from town, he glanced at her. "How do you feel?" "Free," Lydia said and realized it was true. Free from her father's approval. Free from Clara's shadow. Free from the need to be anything other than exactly who she was. The ride home through the dark prairie was peaceful, the kind of silence that comes from comfort rather than awkwardness. When they reached the ranch, every window was dark except the kitchen where a single lamp burned. Sarah had left it for them, along with a note on the table. "Congratulations on winning your war. Now win your marriage. Dinner's in the oven. Eat before bed or you'll both be useless tomorrow." SD. Caleb laughed and pulled the covered dish from the oven, pot roast with vegetables, still warm. They ate at the kitchen table, passing food back and forth, talking about everything and nothing, the buyout terms they'd need to negotiate, the improvements they wanted to make to the ranch, the cattle sale coming up next month. Small, practical things that somehow felt monumental because they were planning a future together. After dinner, Caleb washed while Lydia dried, working in companionable silence. When the last dish was put away, he turned to her with an expression that was suddenly nervous. "I did something," he said. "Earlier today, before the meeting. I should have asked first, but I wanted it to be a surprise." "What did you do?" Instead of answering, he took her hand and led her upstairs. They walked past his bedroom, past her beautiful museum room, to a door at the end of the hall that had always been closed. Caleb opened it. The room inside had been transformed. The furniture was different, a sturdy desk instead of delicate vanity, practical bookshelves instead of decorative mirrors. The bed was smaller but more comfortable looking, covered in a quilt that was beautiful but not fussy. Fresh flowers sat on the windowsill in a simple glass jar. And everywhere, on the desk, the shelves, the small table by the bed, were books. Agricultural economics, contract law, ranch management, accounting principles. The kind of books Lydia had spent years reading in secret, afraid to seem too educated. "I know the other room was prepared for Clara," Caleb said quietly, "with all the lace and fancy things meant for someone else. I thought maybe you'd like your own room, one that's actually yours, with the things you actually care about." Lydia walked into the room slowly, touching the books, the sturdy furniture, the quilt that was pretty but practical. It wasn't a museum display. It was a room for a working woman, a thinking woman, a woman who valued substance over decoration. It was perfect. "When did you do this?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "This morning, before the meeting. I asked Sarah to help. She knew which books you'd been eyeing at the general store, what kind of desk you'd need for working on the accounts. I wanted—" He stopped, searching for words. "I wanted you to have a space that was yours, not Clara's cast-off, not something designed for a woman I expected to marry, just yours." Lydia turned to look at him, this man who'd married her out of spite and slowly learned to see her, who'd fought his father for her freedom, who'd declared his love in front of 300 people, and who'd spent his morning preparing a room that honored who she actually was instead of who everyone thought she should be. "It's the most beautiful thing anyone's ever given me," she said. "It's just a room." "It's not just a room." Lydia crossed to him, taking both his hands in hers. "It's you seeing me, really seeing me. Not the replacement bride or the useful accountant or the burden daughter. Just me, Lydia. The woman who reads too much and prefers ledgers to parties and will never be decorative but might be worth having anyway." "You're worth having," Caleb said fiercely. "You're worth everything." He kissed her then, and it was different from the kiss in the town hall. That one had been declaration. This was invitation, question, and answer. The beginning of something they'd both been too afraid to reach for until now. When they broke apart, Lydia was breathless and flushed, and more certain than she'd ever been about anything. "Your room or mine?" she asked softly. Caleb's smile was slow and warm. "Ours." He led her across the hall to his bedroom, larger than hers, more lived in, with none of the careful decoration of the Clara room. It was a rancher's room, practical and plain. But when Caleb lit the lamp, Lydia saw that he'd made changes here too. Fresh linens on the bed. Flowers. Simple wildflowers, nothing fancy, in a jar on the dresser. And on the nightstand, a small framed sketch. Lydia picked it up, studying it. The sketch showed two people sitting at a kitchen table, working over papers spread between them. The woman was bent over a ledger, her face concentrated. The man was watching her with an expression of quiet wonder. "Where did this come from?" Lydia asked. "I drew it," Caleb admitted, sounding embarrassed. "A few weeks ago, after one of those late nights going through the water rights documents. You were so focused on figuring out the contracts, and I was supposed to be helping, but I just kept watching you instead. Thinking about how you made work feel like partnership instead of obligation. How you made me want to be better at everything. Ranching, managing money, being human. So I drew it. To remember that feeling. Lydia looked at the sketch, then at Caleb, then back at the sketch. In it, she saw herself through his eyes. Not fat or plain or inadequate, but competent and focused and valued. The woman in the sketch looked like someone who mattered. "You see me differently than I see myself," she said quietly. "Maybe you should start seeing yourself the way I see you," Caleb suggested. Strong, smart, beautiful in ways that have nothing to do with lace and curls and all that nonsense. Beautiful because you're real. "I'm working on it," Lydia said, setting down the sketch. "It's hard to undo 23 years of being told you're not enough. But I'm trying." "Then we'll try together." Caleb pulled her close, and they stood like that for a long moment, holding each other, breathing together, letting the day's battles fall away until only this remained. Two people who'd found each other in the wreckage of other people's plans and decided to build something new. What happened next was tender and awkward and imperfect, exactly like their marriage. But it was theirs, chosen and real, and when they finally fell asleep tangled together in sheets that smelled like lavender and Wyoming prairie, Lydia felt something she'd never experienced before. Home. Not a place, but a person. Not something she'd been given, but something she'd earned and built and chosen for herself. Morning came with birdsong and pale sunlight filtering through the curtains. Lydia woke to find Caleb already awake, propped on one elbow, watching her with an expression that made her blush. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "Just thinking," Caleb said, "about how lucky I am. That Clara ran away, that I was angry enough to marry you, that you were brave enough to stay." Some people would call all that disaster, not luck. Some people don't know what they're talking about. Caleb kissed her forehead, her nose, her lips. "Want to know what I think we should do today?" "What?" "Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The ranch can survive one day without us. I want to stay in this room with my wife and pretend the rest of the world doesn't exist." Lydia laughed. "That's the most irresponsible thing I've ever heard you say." "I'm learning from the best." Caleb pulled her closer. "You taught me to balance accounts and negotiate contracts. Now I'm teaching you to occasionally ignore your responsibilities and just be happy." "I don't know how to just be happy," Lydia admitted. "Then we'll figure it out together. Like everything else." They did stay in that room for most of the day, talking and laughing and learning the geography of each other's bodies and histories. Caleb told her about growing up under his father's iron control, about the years of being molded into something he didn't want to be. Lydia told him about life in Clara's shadow, about teaching herself skills nobody valued because they weren't pretty enough to matter. They made plans, real plans for their future, the ranch they'd build together, the improvements they'd make, the life they'd create that would be nothing like what either of their fathers had envisioned. Somewhere around noon, Sarah showed up and banged on the door with pointed disapproval. "There's work to be done," she called. "Cattle don't feed themselves." "One day, Sarah," Caleb called back. "We're taking one day." "Young people," Sarah muttered, but Lydia heard the smile in her voice. "Fine, one day, but tomorrow you're both back to work, or I'm coming in there with a broom." They ate the lunch Sarah left outside the door, sandwiches and lemonade and fresh-baked cookies, and talked about everything and nothing until the sun began to set. That evening, Caleb finally brought up the subject they'd been dancing around all day. "About the buyout," he said. 20 years of payments to my father. That's going to be tight financially, even with the improvements you've made." "I know," Lydia said. "I've already run the numbers. We can do it if we're careful. If we keep the operating costs down, maintain the cattle quality, maybe expand into horses like I suggested last week. It'll be tight, but doable." "We could ask your father for help," Caleb suggested carefully. He seemed like he wanted to make amends. Lydia shook her head firmly. "No. We do this ourselves. I don't want to owe him anything. This ranch is ours. We build it together, we pay for it together, we succeed or fail together. No outside help, no owing anyone." Caleb smiled. "That's going to be hard." I know, but hard is better than obligated. Lydia laced her fingers through his. Besides, we're good at hard. We've built everything we have out of disaster and spite and stubborn determination. What's 20 years of payments compared to that? 20 years, Caleb repeated, pulling her close. You realize that means you're stuck with me until we're almost 50? Longer than that, Lydia corrected. The payments might end in 20 years, but the marriage lasts until death. That was the deal. Till death, Caleb agreed. Think you can stand me that long? I think I can stand you exactly that long and not a day less, Lydia said, kissing him. So you'd better take good care of yourself. Eat your vegetables. Don't get trampled by any cattle. I'm invested in this marriage now, and I expect a good return on investment. Always the accountant, Caleb said, laughing. Always, Lydia agreed. The months that followed were hard, exactly as hard as Lydia had predicted, but no harder. They worked the ranch together, Caleb handling the physical labor while Lydia managed the business side. They made their first payment to Elias on time and with interest. They expanded into horse breeding like Lydia had suggested, and by the end of the first year, the horses were bringing in enough profit to make the payments easier. Elias cashed their checks without comment. He never visited the ranch, never acknowledged their success, never admitted that his son and the unwanted daughter had built something worth having. But the checks cleared, and that was acknowledgement enough. Clara stayed at the Miller Ranch, growing bitter and resentful as the months passed, and no wealthy suitor appeared to rescue her from the scandal she'd created. She never apologized to Lydia, never acknowledged the damage she'd caused. But Lydia stopped waiting for it. Clara's approval, like their father's, had ceased to matter. Lydia did visit her parents occasionally, awkward afternoon teas where her mother asked prying questions about grandchildren, and her father tried too hard to praise accomplishments he'd once dismissed. Lydia accepted the attention with polite distance, knowing it was too late to build the relationship she'd once desperately wanted. But she could maintain civil contact, if only for her own peace of mind. The town of Redemption Bend eventually moved on to newer scandals, though people still talked about the day Elias Ryder was outmaneuvered by the bride nobody wanted. Some told the story with admiration, others with lingering disapproval, but everyone agreed it was the most interesting thing that had happened in the territory in a decade. Lydia learned to live with being interesting. She learned to hold her head high when people whispered, to meet their stares with calm indifference, to value her own opinion above theirs. It took time, years really, but gradually she stopped seeing herself as the fat sister, the replacement bride, the burden daughter. She started seeing herself the way Caleb saw her, strong, smart, capable, valued. 2 years after the town hall showdown, Lydia discovered she was pregnant. The news terrified her. She knew nothing about being a mother, except what she'd learned from her own mother's coldness. But Caleb was delighted. He immediately started making plans for a nursery, buying baby clothes, boring everyone at the general store with his excitement. Their daughter was born on a cold January morning, small and red-faced and perfect. They named her Catherine after Caleb's grandmother, but called her Kate. Lydia held her daughter for the first time and felt something shift inside her, a fierce, protective love that rewrote everything she thought she knew about herself. She would not raise Kate the way she'd been raised. She would not value beauty over intelligence, charm over competence, decoration over substance. She would teach her daughter to read ledgers and negotiate contracts and value her own worth regardless of what anyone else thought. Kate would grow up knowing she was wanted, chosen, valued for exactly who she was. On Kate's first birthday, Thomas and Margaret Miller came to visit, their first time at the ranch since the wedding. They brought expensive presents and awkward attempts at warmth. Clara stayed home, unable to stomach watching her sister's happiness. Watching her mother hold Kate, Lydia felt a complicated mix of emotions. Anger at the years of coldness, sadness for what might have been, but also a strange kind of pity. Margaret had spent her whole life valuing the wrong things, and now she was desperately trying to be part of a granddaughter's life, knowing she'd failed with her own daughters. "She's beautiful," Margaret said, tears in her eyes. "Just beautiful." "She's strong," Lydia corrected gently. "That's better than beautiful." Margaret looked at her daughter, really looked at her, and seemed to see for the first time what she'd spent 23 years ignoring. "You're happy," she said, sounding surprised. "You're actually happy." "I am," Lydia confirmed, "happier than I ever thought possible." I'm sorry, Margaret whispered, for all of it, for not seeing you, for valuing Clara's beauty over your strength, for not protecting you when I should have. The apology was late and imperfect, but Lydia accepted it with grace. I forgive you, she said, not because you earned it, but because holding on to anger takes too much energy. And I need all my energy for the life I'm building now. Margaret nodded, understanding that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, didn't mean erasing the past or pretending the damage hadn't been real, just meant letting go of the weight so both of them could move forward. 5 years after their scandalous wedding, Caleb and Lydia made their final payment to Elias Ryder. Lydia wrote the check herself, her handwriting neat and precise. The amount was exact to the penny. No more, no less. Just what the contract required. She sealed it in an envelope and addressed it to Elias's ranch, then handed it to Caleb. Want to deliver it in person? She asked. Caleb considered, then shook his head. No, let's mail it. Clean break, no drama. We don't owe him anything except money, and now we don't even owe him that. They mailed the check that afternoon. A week later, it cleared. No response came. No acknowledgement, no congratulations, no attempt at reconciliation. Just the silent cashing of a check and the final severing of financial ties. Elias Ryder died 3 years later, alone on his ranch with only his bitterness for company. Caleb went to the funeral out of duty, not love, and returned home relieved that the chapter was finally closed. Any regrets? Lydia asked that night as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the prairie gold and crimson. About my father? No. Caleb took her hand, lacing their fingers together. He made his choices. I made mine. I chose you, and I'd make that choice again every day for the rest of my life. Even knowing what it cost you? It didn't cost me anything I actually valued, Caleb said. My father's approval was never worth having. The ranch I would have inherited from him was built on control and fear. What we've built together is better. Harder work, maybe, but honest. Real. Ours. Lydia leaned her head against his shoulder, watching Kate chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. Their daughter was 8 now, already showing signs of her mother's intelligence and her father's determination. She could balance a simple ledger and sit a horse with equal competence. She read voraciously and asked questions that made adults uncomfortable. She was everything Lydia had been and everything she'd been told she shouldn't be. And she was utterly unashamed of it. We did good, Lydia said softly. We did, Caleb agreed. The unwanted bride and the rebellious son. Not a bad team. Not bad at all. They sat in comfortable silence as night fell over the ranch they'd built together, over the life they'd chosen, over the future they'd created from the wreckage of everyone else's plans. Behind them, the house glowed with lamplight, not a museum for someone else's dreams, but a home filled with books and laughter, and the messy reality of a family that had earned its happiness the hard way. And in that moment, with her husband beside her and her daughter playing in the dusk, and 20 years of hard work and harder choices behind them, Lydia finally allowed herself to believe what she'd spent a lifetime doubting. She was enough. She had always been enough. And the man who'd married her out of spite had somehow learned to love her anyway, not despite who she was, but because of it. The unwanted bride had become the woman who built an empire. The replacement sister had become the wife who was truly chosen. And the burden daughter had become the mother who would teach her own child that worth wasn't measured in beauty or charm or other people's approval, but in strength and intelligence and the courage to build a life on your own terms. It wasn't the fairy tale Clara had chased. It wasn't the alliance her father had wanted or the dynasty Elias had envisioned. It was better than all of that because it was real, earned through work and choice and the stubborn refusal to let other people's opinions define her value. The prairie stretched out before them, vast and beautiful and unforgiving. The same land that had witnessed their scandalous beginning now held their triumph. And somewhere in the distance, coyotes sang to the rising moon while a family built from broken plans and unexpected love sat together on a porch and counted their blessings. Not in wealth or status or public approval, but in partnership and respect, and the quiet knowledge that they had chosen each other, not once in a moment of rebellion, but every day since, in 1,000 small decisions to stay, to work, to build something worth having. The unwanted bride had won, not by becoming wanted, but by becoming necessary. Not through beauty or charm, but through competence and strength. And in winning, she'd discovered that she'd never needed to be chosen by the world. She only needed to choose herself. And she had, every single day.